Freelancing, the Earthborn Prequel. Written by Adair Hart. Narrated by Michael Wolfe. Chapter 1. A stream of bullets flew by Blake Brown's head as he slipped behind a steel pillar in a large underground transportation hub. The Trag mercenaries that had pinned him down wanted him dead, the result of sabotaging their illegal cargo in an unmarked warehouse. Notifying local law enforcement about where to pick it up just pissed off the Trags even more. "Give up already, Fredorian," said one of the mercs. "I'm fucking Earthborn, asshole," said Blake as he squatted and turned his head off to the side. Looking around, he saw the dead civilians that had been caught in the crossfire. It was not something he had intended to happen, but the Trags were ruthless and did not care who got in their way. He pulled a small optical reconnaissance device off his belt and tossed it forward. After a moment, the heads-up display in his helmet showed 3 mercs ducking in and out between the pillars. When one of them tried to cross, Blake peeked out and took aim. One trigger press later, and the merc was on the ground, pumped full of metal. Blake pulled back into cover. "Shit! He got gulsed!" said one of the mercs. Blake ducked as the dinging sound of bullets hitting the pillar filled the air. "You can't live forever," said another merc. "I don't need to. Just longer than you," said Blake. He contemplated his options. Rushing out with his chameleon shield active was not possible since the Trags had sensors for that. They came prepared to hunt him, something he would need to investigate if he survived this. Another option was bouncing a grenade off the wall at them. There was the possibility they could scramble out of the way or have highly rated kinetic shielding. The third option was out of the question. If he had stronger kinetic shielding, he could just run out and lay waste to them. That was the trade-off of having a suit with chameleon versus heavy kinetic shielding. As he was deciding, his HUD showed one of the mercs peeping out. The merc shot a grenade toward Blake. Using his vampire reflexes, Blake angled himself and kicked the grenade back. It hit the ground in front of the nearest merc's pillar and exploded, causing the ceiling to cave in. Blake moved out of the way when his pillar fell toward him. He hugged it close as the pillar hit the wall, creating a small space under it. A part of the ceiling landed on the pillar and then slid to the sides at an angle. The rest of the ceiling piled up around him, trapping him inside. After a moment, all was silent. He closed his eyes and focused. His vampire senses could detect their heartbeats, and the sound of their footsteps was loud, even with the cracking sounds of the rubble around him. A pain shot up his arm as he realized it had been hit by debris. In all the excitement, it had not even registered. Now it did. With his free arm, he grabbed a blood vial out of his belt pocket. Drinking it caused the familiar fire-in-the-blood feeling he had come to rely upon. His active healing kicked in, and his eyes turned a dim blue. He emitted a low growl as strength coursed through him. This was not the worst situation he had ever been in. "You think he's dead?" asked one of the mercs. "No idea. Should probably blow the whole damn place up just to make sure. They say Blake Brown is unkillable, but I think we're about to prove everyone wrong." Blake focused his senses on their positions and placed his hands on the slab facing toward the mercs. With an intense focus, he pushed. The slab launched forward and hit one of the mercs, pinning him to the ground as it landed. Blake lurched forward and pulled out his dual energy blades. With one quick slice, the other startled merc screamed as his arm from the elbow down fell to the ground. Another slice silenced him as his head flew off his body. Blake turned his gaze toward the merc on the ground who was struggling to get out from under the slab. As Blake approached, he checked out his black, light armor to see if there was any damage. After verifying it was in good shape, he thought about how he had gotten to this point. 10 mercs had originally jumped him in the warehouse. These 3 were the only ones who survived to chase him. How they knew he would be there was a mystery. They probably expected him to use his dual energy blades, which was fair. It was one of his more well-known tactics. Too bad for them, he was also well-versed in ranged weaponry. With his enhanced vampire senses, he could smell that the merc had crapped his armor. Trags smelled like shit in general, but when they let loose, it was hard to ignore that smell. He shook his head. Trags. 7-foot-tall, beige-skinned humanoids with bumpy skin, floppy ears, and heavy ridges on their heads. They were tough, physically, but not the brightest. He'd been dealing with them for most of his career. If they were involved, their contractor was short on cash. He retracted his helmet into his neck guard, exposing his pale skin. A cool breeze swept across his face. He rolled his head back and forth while cracking his neck, and then ran a hand along the shaved sides of his scalp. Although the helmet provided good defense and enhanced awareness, having it off and using his pure vampiric senses was sometimes better, depending on the situation. He squeezed the back of his neck and then brushed his hand through the short, jet black hair that stood up on the top of his head. As he squatted next to the merc, he shook a finger and said, "I bet you're wondering, is Blake Brown going to drink me dry?" The merc struggled to breathe as his eyes fluttered. "Oh, don't worry. Your blood is like drinking mud water. Works in a pinch, but not something any self-respecting vampire would touch," said Blake. With a pat on the merc's bobbing head, Blake said, "Your death is coming. I can sense it and smell it. Maybe next time you ambush me and try to kill me, you actually do it. If you don't, well, things like this happen." The merc spit up blood as he began to wheeze. Blake reached over to the merc's vest and rummaged around. He pulled out a small credit card-like device. Shaking it at the merc, he said, "This'll help me fill in some of the blanks. I appreciate you bringing it to my attention." He eyed the dying merc as he stood. "Enjoy your death. If I were you, I'd be pissed if I died." The merc shuddered, then stopped moving. Looking around, Blake noted that the rest of the pillars were still standing. He picked up the optical reconnaissance device he had tossed out earlier and put it back into a panel that extended out from his upper leg. The sound of footsteps caught his attention. With a tap at his belt, a chameleon shield enveloped him, blending him in with the environment. Alcarez civilians had already begun to filter in from the ramps, and the distant sound of incoming law enforcement could be heard. The Alcarez were a rowdy humanoid race with a penchant for violence. Their home world of Gorith was long known as a safe haven for illegal activities. It was no surprise Trags would be found there. When the first response robots arrived, Blake had reached the ramp at the opposite end of the hub and was on his way out. He knew that the always-on security feed would probably have recorded the whole encounter, at least before being destroyed by the cave-in. Given how many aliens were around, it would be difficult to identify a faceless defender with body armor and a helmet similar to the local citizens. He located a transportation tube and waited for the next available unit. When it arrived, he hopped in and entered the destination coordinates to the nearby spaceport. It was time to leave. "Estimated time of arrival, 45 minutes, said the unit. He sighed as he placed his assault rifle off to the side and relaxed back into his seat. Checking his wrist device showed it to be March 5th, 2032, 2 o'clock p.m. Although time varied in many areas where he traveled, he still used Earth time as his guide. As a vampire, he needed a set amount of sleep every 6 months. He could do part of it per day, or in chunks per week, or even by month. Ingestion of blood helped sustain any side effects from sleep deprivation. On Earth, he would sleep 6 months every few years. As a ranger, he would take a few weeks off every 6 months between missions. Although he had spent over 400 years on Earth as a vampire, he never had to deal with aliens much. That was usually the domain of the Helians, the group that represented Earth to the galactic community due to their advanced technological status. His eyes narrowed. He was only here because he had been exiled by the Helians for killing one of their enforcers, known as managers. That exile meant galactic slavers had captured him during his month-long sleep in Minnesota. A small grin formed as he thought about how he killed all but one of the slavers when they tried to wake him on the ship. That led him to Fredoria, a destination planet for humans that had been abducted, then freed. Fredoria was his new homeworld. He tried to explain that he needed to go back to Earth, but Fredoria said that was not possible. Apparently, Earth was a protected planet, since it had not utilized condensed space travel yet. It was under the control of the Kregan Star Empire, the regional galactic superpower. Per Kregan law, any human from Earth or Earthborn that had been abducted could not return to Earth in an effort to avoid knowledge pollution. Instead, they were sent to Fredoria. Fredoria had been generous to him, but after many generations, it had its own culture, one that looked down on Earthborn, or so it seemed to him. Fredoria classified him as a daedrold, although vampire was the more common term. Being a vampire made things worse, as most Fredorians considered him an abomination. Given how many aliens there were, he found that curious. He sighed as he focused on his current mission. Discovering the location of the illegal cargo was the easy part, since he had a master rank among the Fredorian Rangers, an elite unit separate from the Fredorian Defense Force. Rangers still reported to the Fredorian government, but were voted in by the people, something the FDF hated. Missions like the one he just completed were not something the FDF usually handled. The hard part of the mission had been placing the beacons that alerted the local authorities. Typically, the movers were one step ahead of local law enforcement, but not if they were tracked. He looked down at his weapon. He had seen many in his time. Fredorian assault rifles were blocky in design, with multiple barrels that extended out. Despite being known for the ability to spit metal at high velocity, they could also shoot grenades and were light in general. The recoil was not too bad, and they were fairly accurate at short to medium range. The 34th version of the Fredorian assault rifle, or FAR-34 Striker, was standard among the Rangers due to its versatility. He also carried 2 side pistols, but rarely used them. A smile crept onto Blake's face. This was his last mission with the Rangers, and he was looking forward to moving on. All that was left was to get to his ship, dock with a Kregan transport headed to Fredoria, then meet with Rakar Hojador, a Kregan Grand Master Ranger that formed the Fredorian version of the Kregan Rangers. Although he held a similar rank in the Fredorian Rangers, he was transitioning to a new role outside the Rangers, but Blake did not know which one. When Blake arrived at his destination, he disembarked from the transportation unit and headed into the main hub of the spaceport. It did not take long to get clearance to leave via one of the console interfaces that peppered the large room. He did not have anything with him other than his suit, his blades, his side pistols, and his striker. So he headed to the walkway that led out to his ship. The sight of his ship always made him comfortable. It looked more like a small shuttlecraft, which helped in deception more often than not. Although it was not the greatest in battle, it could move and had basic stealth ability, although stealth usually meant blending in with the surrounding environment, since most sensors could easily detect a ship in open space. That was all he needed. Something to get him from place to place within a system. If he had to cross solar systems, he had to be booked on a larger ship that had condensed space drives. The process for leaving the planet was painless and much easier than on Fredoria. There were very few questions asked, which suited the nature of the city he was in. After boarding his ship, he fired it up and turned on the autopilot after setting the destination. It would take about 20 minutes to clear the planet, and another 20 to dock. Then it would be about 10 hours until he was back at Fredoria. He was looking forward to the accommodations of the Kregan transport. They usually had level 2 matter replicators and small rooms for travelers. Expensive, but he was not footing the bill. As his ship ascended through the planet's atmosphere, he kicked back in the cramped quarters of his ship and watched the clouds go by. At 10 o'clock a.m. the next day, Blake was cleaned up and on his way to a meeting with Ricard. As Blake walked toward the Fredorian Ranger outpost near his apartment, he observed the trees that lined the path. The smell of fresh-cut grass wafted past him, and the sounds of insects buzzed around. It was the small things that reminded him of Earth. The flying craft and the drab, white-themed dress of the Fredorians brought him back to reality. Still, he liked New Dakota. It had a large Earthborn population, and he enjoyed visiting the little Earth district. New Dakota was a decent-sized city, and he was thankful to live on the outskirts of it. As he approached the outpost, a young Fredorian man in a solid gray outfit with light body armor and a striker stood at attention. He slapped his fist to his chest when Blake was near. Blake paused. A salute? "New protocol, sir." "It's Blake. And you don't need to salute me," he said as he examined the young man. "Junior Ranger? Rank 1? "Yes, sir. Blake." Blake furrowed his eyebrows. "Where'd this protocol come from?" "Master Ranger Grick Talkus has initiated a new set of policies and protocols to be followed by all junior rangers in training." Blake slapped the young man on the arm. "Good luck, kid." He shook his head as he entered the building. The outpost had been a home away from home for him for a long time. It was his first posting, and later in his career, his final one. It was not hard to find the office that Ricard would be using as a temporary work office while visiting. There was always a suite of offices dedicated to Master Ranger and higher. When he arrived at Ricard's office, he peeked his head in. "They keeping you busy?" Ricard looked up from his desk. "Blake Brown! Come on in." He stood and extended a hand. Blake always liked Ricard, even if he was a Cregan. Ricard was level-headed and tough, and his case studies were something of a legend around the Rangers. Creegans were humanoids with purple skin that stood between 6 and 7 feet tall, and the back of their heads curved up. They were physically stronger and faster than a human, and some argued more intelligent overall. Blake shook Ricard's hand and sat down. With a nod to the door, Blake said, "Junior Rangers saluting, and new policies and protocols." "Grick's been busy." Ricard sighed as he sat. "He runs the Rangers now. It's his choice on how it operates. I can give him advice while I transition out, but I hold no leadership role anymore." "Much more formal," said Blake. He shook his head. "The Rangers were supposed to be a loose organization, easy come, easy go. It's one of the reasons we're so effective. Also fits my personality." Ricard looked down. "I know. It's how I formed the Rangers initially." He raised his head with his lips drawn flat. "However, since Fredoria became a full trade partner with the Creegans 20 years ago, things have changed. It seems I cannot compete with Fredorian supremacy." "So all it took was the FDF getting someone to Master Ranger to absorb the Rangers, and then they could kick you out?" Ricard nodded. "You know they don't like us, especially since we're molded after the Cregan version I was a part of." "I guess it was always coming. So what role do you have now?" "My official title is Chief Presidential Advisor. However, I seem to spend most of my time as Andia Kig's liaison to the other government bodies." "President Andia Kiggs," said Blake, leaning forward. "I know you never mentioned how you came to know her, but from what I saw on the Cregan LawNet, it had something to do with Fredoria becoming a full trade partner. There wasn't a lot of information there, though." Ricard eyed Blake. "The less is known, the better." "As expected," said Blake with a grin. "Almost as odd as you finding me so fast when I got to Fredoria 20 years ago." Ricard smiled. "Don't pursue it." "I figured," said Blake. It's very coincidental, is all. I suspect someone else was involved in both events. Someone powerful. So, last day, said Ricard, clearing his throat. Blake shook his head as he tossed the credit card-like device he had retrieved from the Trag Merc onto the desk. All right, subject change then. I suppose you've already heard about what happened on my last mission. I sure did, said Ricard. He tapped at the array of options that appeared on the surface around the device on his desk. After a moment, he said, You still completed the mission, but it looks like you have a private bounty on your head. Yeah, which sorta explains how those Trag Mercs knew exactly where to find me. Not only were they trying to collect, they were given details on the mission. I had to fight it out in the warehouse and the streets, and then finally in the subway. Ended badly for them. You would know more about that than me. You're one of our best intelligence agents, said Ricard. Blake ran his tongue over his fangs. I have some ideas, but nothing concrete. Ricard eased back into his chair. You think it's the FDF, don't you? I'm just saying. I have some ideas. Blake tilted his head. I'm also Earthborn and classified as a Daedrold, not exactly a winning combination in Fredoria, much less the FDF. I never understood that, said Ricard, narrowing his eyes. You're both human. Well, you were at some point. The only difference is you were born on Earth and abducted, and they were born on Fredoria. I'm just glad you like Earthborn, said Blake. I noticed there's quite a few in the Rangers. Ricard smiled. That's by design. As a good friend once told me, Earthborn can be more feisty than they let on. I've found that to be true. They're more open to new ideas and, in general, easy to relax around. That's odd for a Cregan to say since they look down on humans. Not all Creegans, said Ricard. He looked away for a moment. I owe my life to some Earthborn. They saved me, and Andia, by extension. He glanced at Blake. I'll never forget that. They were noble, great, and heroic, and came through when my own race did not. Blake noted the serious look on Ricard's face. Blake had tried to find out more about the full trade partner event. The data was minimal, and what data there was had been altered. I'm glad they represented then. You know you're always welcome in Little Earth whenever you want. He beamed a big smile that bared his fangs. We love aliens there. Ricard snorted while shaking his head. That's another thing that seems to come natural for Earthborn. Humor, part of my character. I know, and I have to ask, what are you going to do now? Blake rubbed his chin for a moment, and then said, I've been thinking about maybe freelancing. I still have a lot of contacts out there, and my hands wouldn't be tied by Fredorian law. Ricard nodded. Freelancing may be more lucrative now, but it's also a lot more dangerous, perhaps. But remember, you're talking to Blake Brown here. Fredoria could get a lot more done behind the scenes if they employed freelance groups, like the Creegans do for hunters. Ricard snorted. Maybe one day it'll come to that. Just imagine what could be done. Remember the Terrace incident? A Grosadian merc group walks into a Fredorian rim world colony, murders over 15 Fredorians, but nothing is done in order to maintain relations. If I was freelancing, those killers would have been destroyed. Ricard sighed. I know. At least when I'm freelancing, I'll be free to make my own decisions. I understand, said Ricard. I don't blame you for leaving. I just hope it's not a trend with other Earthborn Rangers. I think they're the last bulwark against Grick and his ambitions. You staying in could provide a lot of leadership. I'm not a leader type. I prefer to work alone, like I have throughout my career, but I can group up as needed, said Blake. Maybe so, but even when grouped, you like to call the shots. Blake laughed. I guess so. He exhaled from his nose. To be honest, I'm surprised Andia allowed Grick's appointment. Politics, said Rakar. That's more her arena than mine. Also, I wouldn't sell yourself short. I think you would make an excellent leader. With the right crew. Blake shook his head. Always recruiting. Of course. What are you going to do for a ship? Well, I have some credits stored away to get one, and with a pilot, that should be all we need to get started. Seth Williams, said Rakar. Blake smiled. He's my abductee brother. Can't fight for shit, but he can fly almost anything. I'm glad I didn't drain him during our abduction. Rakar gestured outward. Blake Brown and Seth Williams. You're always welcome to join our little group. I can't abandon Andia, said Rakar, furrowing his eyebrows. Blake drew his head back a bit. Oh. Oh, I see. You two, nothing like that. She's a very close friend. Blake laughed. Uh-huh. I just had to ask. He stood and looked around. Well, I guess it's time to get this show on the road. At least there are no ceremonies to attend. I'm glad you at least put that in. He loved the informal nature of the Rangers. Although they had some ceremonies, they dispensed with the majority of them, something the FDF pointed to as lack of respect. Before you go, I have a gift for you, said Rakar. He reached under his desk and pulled out a black cube with digital lines etched on top. This information cube has most of Earth's media from the last 50 years, movies, TV shows, music, and a copy of what they call the Internet. Blake's eyes widened. Information retrieval from a protected planet was a crime under Kregan law. How did you get a hold of that? I have a friend. The only friend I know of who could pull that off is the information broker, and maybe a few others, said Blake. Rakar grinned. I'm impressed, said Blake, holding up the cube and looking it over. Talk about friends in high places. I'll make good use of this. Rakar stood and raised a finger. I can get you yearly updates as well, if you want them. I'll hold you to that, said Blake with his lips pulled to the right. Rakar extended a hand. Keep in touch. Blake shook Rakar's hand and, with the information cube tucked under his arm, headed out. Chapter 2. Rakar walked down the hallway of the main building in the Fredorian presidential compound. The meeting with Blake was fresh in Rakar's mind, and the 2-hour trip allowed him to go over it. Part of him was glad that Blake would still be around freelancing. The other part wished he would have stayed a ranger to act as a counter to Grick. Blake was unlike any human he had known, Earthborn or Fredorian. When Rakar arrived at the compound, the security guards hassled him. He was used to it, being a Kregan. Most Fredorians viewed Kregans as superior physically and mentally, and it bore an inferiority complex that he saw played out at times. The rising trend of it bothered him. He nodded at the various officials as he passed them. Knowing them by name was a perk of coming to the presidential compound so often. As he approached the office he was headed to, the 2 guards outside the door challenged him. A fair-skinned, medium-sized woman hustled to the door. Her piled-up brunette hair stood out in contrast to her silver-lined white suit, a look befitting the Fredorian president. Let him in, said Andia with a stern look on her face. He's been coming here for years. Why are you challenging him now? New protocols, Madam President, said one of the guards. According to whom? Asked Andia. Commander Attic. This is the first time hearing about it, said Andia. She shook her head. He reports to me. He'll get a call in a bit. Yes, Madam President, said the guard. She smiled at Rakar and gestured inward. It's been a while. Rakar eyed the guards as he passed between them. The look of disgust in their eyes was evident. They were probably Fredorian supremacists, not uncommon in the Presidential Guard. He took a seat as Andia sat behind her desk. Andia tapped at the surface in front of her and then slid her fingers around. The door to the room sealed shut. She looked up at Rakar. We can talk in private now. Rakar nodded back toward the door. I've been noticing a lot of new protocols lately. The FDF, the Guard, and now even the Rangers, she said with a smirk. The unusual part is that they all have different command structures, but they still all eventually report to the Presidential Council. These protocols are something being initiated by those lower in command. I'll sort it out. Enough about that. What brings you out here? I have news on one of our assets. Andia placed her hands together as she leaned forward on her desk. Which one? Blake Brown. He retired, just as you said he would. I thought maybe he would stick around, but you called it. He's a Daedrold. But more importantly, he's Earthborn. I knew that the moment he saw all these changes, and he had a way out, he'd take it. Rakar half smiled. You also predicted he would freelance. Of course. Earthborn liked to get things done. He was a great ranger, maybe one of the best we had, but I suspect we both know which side he'll support in the coming years. We have some insight into the future in regards to Blake. Yes, we do. He narrowed his eyes. I don't envy the responsibilities you have to juggle. Andia shrugged. We got the full trade partner status with Kriegis 20 years ago, and navigating all the competing interests who want to take advantage of that situation has been trying. Yeah, definitely your arena. Andia tapped at her desk for a moment. I'd like you to have an office here. Expecting problems? Just a hunch at the moment. It'd be good to have someone I fully trust nearby. Rakar raised his head a bit. You can always count on me. Also, I need you to keep tabs on Blake. Don't lose him. I've already arranged for information drops with the information broker. You'll need to balance your time picking those up with your time here. Not a problem. I figured as much, said Andia as she rose. I've just allocated you an office, and your new living quarters are next to mine. Rakar rose and smiled. Next to yours. She leaned across the desk and tilted her head. Is that a problem? He shook his head as he leaned in and gave Andia a passionate kiss. After they separated, she smiled. There are other personal responsibilities you will need to attend to while living there. I look forward to it, said Rakar with angled eyebrows. Seth Williams ran his dark-skinned hand over his short, curly black hair as he walked to the shipyard office. Looking down, he knew that his gray pilot suit and black combat boots were more Earthborn than Fredorian-inspired, and it riled up the Fredorians who glanced his way. It was not white, for starters, and it had pockets, a utility belt, and dark gray light padding on various parts of the body. More importantly, it was loose. Fredorians liked everything to be crisp and form-fitting, and his suit would be considered disgraceful. Still, it had served him well. It was time to collect his final payout. Then he would meet up with Blake. Seth did flight work on a contract-by-contract basis, but usually collected at the end of the year. In this case, he was collecting early and was not taking the next contract. The Fredorian Commerce Agency had a regular group of pilots, but they were all Fredorian. They said it was open to Earthborn, but he found it next to impossible to get in. Instead, he took the more dangerous routes and contracts, which the Fredorians seemed more than happy to farm out to Earthborn and freelance contractors. The ships he flew all had food and shelter, and if he needed anything that required credits, the company usually covered it. A final payout for all the contract work he had done for the year so far was easy money to him. He appreciated that the Fredorians had taken him in after his abduction when he was 16, but ever since then, he felt like the system was against Earthborn. Sure, they had food, drink, shelter, and entertainment, but he knew that if he did not gain any skills, boredom could set in, which sometimes led to disastrous events. It was no coincidence to him that Earthborn often lived together and also accounted for approximately 20% of all prisoners. He had enjoyed the thought of flying and, after learning the ropes, spent the next 20 years contracting for it. The shipyard office, with its multiple entrance doors, loomed in front of him as he walked the final stretch up the ramp. Once he was inside the small foyer area, the door behind him sealed, shutting him in. He waited while several beams washed over him. Once they stopped, the door in front of him opened. He continued on into the large, plaza-like room. Robots, androids, and Fredorians bustled from place to place, intent on whatever they were doing. The payout office was easy to spot. It was the busiest place in the plaza, and only took him a few minutes to reach. There was a long line filled with other contractors, and he was thankful he would not have to join them. He shook his head at the thought that with all the automation available, they still required a physical check-in to collect funds. Fredorians did not have to go through this. Looking to his right, he headed off to collect his yearly payments, which Jamis usually handled. When Seth arrived, he knocked on the closed door. A screen on the door showed Jamis.
"Little early, aren't we?"
"Not if it's your last run," said Seth. The door clicked, then slid back. Seth walked in and took a seat while nodding at Jamis. For a Fredorian, he was all right. He was tan with short black hair, and unlike most Fredorians, he had a sense of humor.
"So what's all this about a last run?"
asked Jamis. Seth tossed a hand out. "New priorities."
"It's not FDF, is it?"
"No way, man. You know that's not me. My friend needs help, so I'm going to help him."
Jamis scratched his head as he leaned back in his chair. "You're one of our best cargo pilots. Never been held up, and have the highest delivery rate in times I've ever seen."
"Don't I know it?" said Seth with a smile.
Jamis sighed. "You know you could move up the ranks if you wanted."
"As an Earthborn?"
Jamis narrowed his eyes. "You know we don't care about that out here."
"I know. And it's appreciated. This is one of the few places where an Earthborn is treated as an equal," said Seth. He eyed Jamis. "You know, I never asked why you took this job. Seems like it'd be a hassle."
"It can be. But you know, people like me need to be in these types of positions to make sure everything's fair."
"Fredorian duty," said Seth with a smile. "Your dedication is impressive." Jamis laughed. He interacted with his desk surface, and after a moment, he said,
"Your payment has been transferred. I still don't know what you need credits for. You have everything you need."
Seth licked his lips. "If you stay on Fredoria." Jamis eyed Seth for a moment, then nodded.
"It's dangerous out there, but the choice is yours. If you change your mind, you know where to come."
Seth rose and shook Jamis's hand. "Appreciate it. You might see me again if things fall through." He dipped his head and then took off. It did not take him long to reach the lot on the shipyard where various aliens and Fredorians mingled to sell ships. He knew that all the ships were certified, and he had his eye on one. It was a small ship with a bad paint job and some minor defects he figured he could work on, but it would do. All that was left was to wait on Blake. He took his time as he strolled past various ships and checked them out. 20 minutes later, he spotted Blake approaching the lot. There was something tucked under his arm, and he was all smiles. Seth hustled up to the lot entrance and realized Blake had an information cube under his arm. Seth pointed at it. "So, what have we here?" Blake handed the cube to Seth.
50 years of Earth media."
"No shit," asked Seth as he spun the cube around in his hands.
"Yeah. It was a parting gift from a friend."
"That's a pretty nice friend you got." You know how hard it is to get something like this? Not to mention illegal.
Blake nodded. Whatever it takes so I don't have to listen to any crappy pirated feeds. They shared a laugh. Seth narrowed his eyes.
Was this your only parting gift?
Don't worry. I got 100,000 credits. That should be more than enough to pick out a ship you like.
Seth nodded. That's 140,000 credits between us. These ships don't have weapon-grade replicators, so we'll need to save some for ammo and whatever weapons we need.
All I need is ammo for my pistols and striker. Blades don't need anything, said Blake. However, I could use some mods if we have credits to spare.
Well, at least you got a real man's weapon, said Seth, tapping his own 2 heavy pistols strapped to his upper thighs.
They work when I need to take out weaker opponents, said Blake, drawing his lips to the right.
He gestured toward the various ships.
Pick anything out?
Seth nodded and crooked his thumb. I think so. Come on. They walked over to a small ship sitting out on the edge of the lot. Seth gestured at it as he walked around it. I know it doesn't look like much, but it has a condensed space drive, level 1 replicator, reflective armor, heavy kinetic shielding, and a fusion-powered ion drive. More importantly, it has 2 private quarters.
Blake slapped Seth's arm with the back of his hand. The most critical part.
He bobbed his head around as he surveyed it. Looks like the shuttle I used, except a bit bigger. Well, it has no stealth, at least what passes as stealth, so it's not quite as functional. And if we get into a fight, it's better if we run.
So essentially a glorified transport, said Blake.
Seth raised 2 fingers, one with 2 private quarters.
They both chuckled.
Blake furrowed his eyebrows for a moment. In that case, it'll limit the type of contracts we can take. We'll have to start small, but in time we'll get a bigger ship and some extra crew. Speaking of contracts, what's the plan there?
Kilikun, said Blake.
I know you don't like that place, but it's one of the biggest gatherings of people with contracts who don't want a digital trail. Seth sighed. Never been there, but I've heard the stories, and I'm sure Fredoria's bad reputation will follow us. I always found it healthy to stay away from places like that, and I expect we'll get in a fight. Well, you'll get in a fight.
I never start them,
but I will end them. Of course you will, said Seth. He nodded at the ship. We good with this? Blake slapped Seth on the back.
I trust your judgment.
Since you'll be flying it, pick whatever you're comfortable with. Then this one it is, said Seth. It's 70 grand. That leaves us 30 for ammo and weapons.
You mean 70 for ammo and weapons.
You forgot your 40,000 contribution. Seth smiled. Oh, yeah, right.
Blake shook his head.
I'm gonna go get some ammo. Want anything other than that? Seth rubbed his chin. Not sure yet. I'd like to take a look after buying this.
All right.
I'll see you there then.
Chapter 3.
Blake looked around the small cockpit as Seth piloted the ship. They had stocked up for the trip and were on their way to Kilikun. There was enough room to walk to the exit hatch in the back, but other than that, it was just the cockpit and a hallway to move around in. The private quarters, right behind the cockpit, turned out to be a bed, a locker, and a shelf to store things. Beyond that was a general bathroom and a space to sit at a small table that had a matter replicator in the wall. There was an engine room and various other rooms dedicated to ship maintenance, but they were small and cramped. It was definitely a step down from what he was used to. But if it did what it had to, he was okay with that. Activating the condensed drive, said Seth. Blake watched as the spiral on the large wraparound screen began to fill up. Condensed space travel always made him leery. He did not fully understand how a ship could pop out of one space and go to another where space was condensed. This allowed for fast travel, and the bigger the condensed space drive, the faster you could go. It had something to do with the shape of the field and the power exerted on it. At least, that was how it was explained to him. When the spiral filled, a glow appeared outside the ship. Blake noticed that the glow followed a curve, which he understood to be the shields interacting with the condensed space tunnel they had entered. They had already flown a bit away from Fredoria, and the sun in the distance dimmed. That was the aspect that made his skin crawl. Everything seemed like a fuzzy filter had been placed over it. Anything with large mass had to be skirted, but open space was a free-for-all. Seth tapped at the screen, causing the navigation charts to light up. Pressing where Killican would be caused the ship to accelerate. Blake narrowed his eyes as they flew past the sun. He knew in normal space it would have taken much longer. Sit back and enjoy the ride. It's about 3 light years away, so probably about 9 hours, said Seth. Blake sighed. His ranger ship could do that in about 7.5 hours. He glanced at Seth. We could have taken a Cregan transport. We could. But we would have had to wait an extra day. Not only that, but shaving a few hours isn't worth 5,000 credits. Just think about it when we get a bigger ship with a better drive. Blake nodded. You do your pilot thing. I'll do my nap thing. Have fun, said Seth. I'm going to check out some of the sweet media from that cube. He smiled. Don't worry, the rooms are soundproofed once sealed. Better be, said Blake as he stood. When he got to his quarters, he noted there was barely enough room to sit on the bed and get his boots off. He could see traveling around like this would be somewhat challenging, but figured it would only be for a few contracts. After slipping off of his light body armor, he lay in bed, put his hands behind his head, and began to nod off. Sleeping like this shortened his longer sleep, which was due in a few months. 9 hours later, he fell out of bed as the ship trembled. He jumped up and slid back the door. Seth! What the hell was that? Just a friendly greeting from one of the local mercs. What? Don't worry. They knew our shields would hold. It was a weak shot. Not the first time this has happened to me. Besides, you wanted to come here, not me. Blake harumphed as he slipped on his body armor and boots and hustled up to his seat. The sound of reggae massaged his ears as he scanned the console. Nice choice. Now where are these mercs? Gone already? We're here, said Seth, nodding forward. Blake looked out the window and saw the slime pit known as Killican. It had been a while since he'd been there, and although he knew this was where they had to start out, the earlier shot fired reminded him of what to expect. Bounty hunters, freelancers, justice hunters, mercs, vigilantes, and every type of criminal came here at some point. He just hoped it had not changed too much. I've got clearance to land already, said Seth. I need to take a whiz. We gonna be stable? Have at it. It's smooth sailing from here. After 30 more minutes, they had landed. Various ships sat around them, and the area was packed with crews and the locals trying to hustle. Blake shook his head. Killican. What a dump. We're in the right city, right? Yeah. I've been here before. We should plan on sleeping in the ship. Aw, come on, man. It ain't that bad. Seth gulped. Is it? Blake pointed out the window at a shakedown in progress. Make sure you're ready to use your pistols. At all times. Got it. So, what's the first stop? Gambuno's. It's a place for contractors and those with contracts to meet up. All we need to do is register and then hang out until we're contacted. They also have some digital postings we can check out too, said Blake. Seth nodded and shut down the ship. Let's roll. As they moved off the lot and onto one of the main streets, 2 humanoid aliens approached them. Blake knew them to be Unherals, a thin humanoid race with buggy eyes, green skin, and chitin-like armor on their bodies. They wore grungy robes, but their walk and the antenna sticking out from the hoods were dead giveaways. One of them pushed his robe to the side, revealing a weapon. Transfer your credits to us, Fredorian scum. Blake laughed. Do you know you're talking to Blake Brown? The Unherals took a step back. This is how it works. 1, I can kill you both. 2, you can try to fight me and then I'll kill you both. 3, you give us 300 credits and I let you live. The Unheralds talked among themselves for a moment. Blake smiled as he tapped at his forearm, causing a screen to appear with a galactic unique identifier, known as a GUID, which resembled a string of random numbers and letters. That's our deposit account. After a moment, he closed the screen and nodded at the Unheralds. It was a pleasure doing business with you. The Unheralds scattered. Too easy, said Blake. Blake found it interesting that for as long as he had been around Fredoria, everyone spoke Cregan. Galactic translation devices were commonplace, and everyone had one. So even if a species did not speak Cregan, as long as their language was mapped, it could still be understood. Not everything mapped correctly, though. As they continued to walk, Seth said, "What exactly did you do to earn that type of rep out here?" "I survived." "Cut the shit, man. You being serious?" "You don't play in this game and live as long as I have unless you're damn good." Seth sighed. "I have a feeling I'd be eaten alive out here without you." Blake nodded. His thoughts wandered to the first time he met Seth. They both had been abducted by Sesselter slavers. Seth had watched as Blake drained all but one of the slavers. Although Seth would never know, Blake would have drunk everyone dry if the other slaves had not been caged. That was the penalty for going into bloodlust. They were rescued by Fredorian Rangers and taken to an Earthborn refugee city. Seth, being 16 at the time, wanted no part of anything for a while, but decided to learn to fly. He had been more impressed with the ships involved rather than the rescue. Ever since that event, Blake often called Seth his abductee brother. When they reached Gambuno's a half-hour later, the familiar scent of food, drink, and shit caressed Blake's nose. It reminded him of the many times he had been there. Although he was doing intelligence work at the time, he had come to appreciate what Gambuno's offered. It was contracting for those seeking discretion. Seth wrinkled his nose. "Damn, this place stinks." "You'll get used to it." "I guess." Two burly, reptilian-like humanoids stood outside the entrance. One of them hissed at Blake. "Blake Brown. No trouble. Or I trouble." Blake bared his fangs as he smiled. He knew them to be Kazarulians. Their planet had been enslaved and then freed, and they had entered the security field. He held two hands out in front of him while shaking his head. Fellas. I'm never trouble. You fight. You bite." Blake laughed as he dipped his head to the right. "As I told my friend here, I don't start them," he said, dipping his head to the other side. "But I do end them." The Kazarulians growled and then waved them in. Once inside, Blake pointed to a table in the distance. "We can register and browse from there. They actually have some human food and drink replicator patterns here, but the replicators are by the bar. I usually just have the waiter get me a whiskey and bring it to the table." Seth grimaced as they headed over. "No table replicators? That's some old school shit there." "Yeah, I may get a drink, but definitely not interested in eating here." "They have a level 3 replicator. Much better than anything our ship can produce." "I'll live," said Seth as he took a seat. He ran a finger across the table's interface. Blake gestured forward. "I don't think we'll find any decent contracts there, but check if there are any simple find or retrieval ones. I have a contact in the area that makes those types of contracts trivial." "Easy money." Seth nodded as he focused on the changing screen on the table's surface. After a few minutes, Seth shook his head. "Ain't shit here." "As I figured." "So, we just... what? Wait now?" "Get yourself comfortable, my abductee brother," said Blake as he eased back into the booth. "Well, then maybe I'll try some of that whiskey." "You won't be disappointed." "Better not be," said Seth, chuckling as he fixed his gaze back at the screen. Over the next few hours, Seth began to yawn. Although he had taken a nap in the cockpit while Blake had slept, he knew he could fall asleep if he had to. Flying a freighter for 20 years had conditioned him to sleep when he could. The adrenaline pumping through him had kept him alert to this point. Gambunos looked like a place where you could get yourself killed fairly quickly. In the short time he had been there, he had seen several fights. One alien had had its face shot point blank. The shooter was hustled out of the area, and Blake had mentioned that the shooter would most likely be killed once outside due to violating neutral ground. As Seth studied the other contracts available, his attention focused on Blake tapping the table. "Incoming," said Blake. Seth looked up and saw 3 trags in light armor headed their way. He had to deal with them before in his career, and usually on the flying away from end. He rested his hand on one of his heavy pistols while narrowing his eyes. His heartbeat thumped away as the trags neared. They were not only physically imposing, but they had a smell that reminded him of rotting garbage. The trags paused outside the booth. The lead one glared at Blake and, in a deep, gravelly voice, said, "Blake Brown. Hear you wasted Gulst's crew." Blake nodded. "I killed 7 when they ambushed me, got Gulst, and had a roof dropped on the remaining 2. The trags growled. "I'm surprised you heard about it already," said Blake. The lead trag licked his rough lips. "News travels fast, especially when you're the bounty backup." Blake tilted his head. "So you're here to kill me then? Or at least attempt to. This is neutral ground, unless you want to change the rules." The trags laughed. "Not at all," said the lead trag. "We're here to honor you for taking down one of the better groups out there. May your death be at our hands the next time we meet." Seth gulped. He had never interacted with trags before, other than knowing what they did to the freighters they caught. The confident nature of Blake steadied Seth, and it blew his mind that Blake could not only deal with trags, but relish the opportunity. Blake grinned as he raised his shot of whiskey. "And here's to when I put a bullet in all 3 of you, and then take a piss on your corpses." The trags nodded and walked off as Blake downed his shot. "You gotta be shitting me. That actually worked?" said Seth. "What? Avoiding a fight?" "Yeah. They look like they were gonna kill us right here and now," said Seth. Blake waved a hand dismissively. "Nah. If I apologized and begged for my life, yeah. Then we might have been attacked. Trags respect power. You show weakness, they'll jump." "Well, not all of us worked intelligence to know that. I just got the hell out whenever a trag ship was in the same region, never really stopped to chat with them. I'm guessing the next time we see them, they're gonna attack." "Don't worry about them. Next time we see them, we'll kill them. Simple as that." Seth shook his head. "Still fearless after all these years." "You know you like that about me." Seth tapped the table. "Incoming." He eyed the approaching tall, thin humanoid with enormous blue eyes on a bulbous head. The humanoid wore a robe with a belt that carried 2 side pistols. If he had to guess, it was male. But given what he knew of sex and aliens, it could be anything. Blake sat back and eyed the humanoid. "You handled that situation well," said the humanoid in a soft yet controlled voice. With a bow, he said, "You can call me Lalric. I have come to see about your availability." Blake tilted his head. "We can only do small ones. Just starting out and all." "You're Blake Brown. I've heard of you," said Lalric. "May I join you?" Blake scooted in toward Seth and gestured at the empty slot. "You've done your research. Slide on in." "Seth Williams," said Seth, raising a hand. Lalric nodded at Seth and then took a seat and eyed the surface. "Not finding much, are you?" "Not ones we would take," said Seth. "I'm guessing you probably already figured that out, which is why you're here." Lalric smiled. "Of course, this is what I do. If you're looking, I have a simple retrieval contract. One of our freighters was taken by an outlaw known as Alcarez." Seth eyed Lalric. "Isn't that something your local law enforcement would handle?" Blake shook his head while crooking a thumb at Lalric. "He's Tansy. They rely on Cregan enforcement and hire contractors for the rest. They're also the founders of one of the bigger trade guilds. I'm guessing whatever was on that freighter is something they don't want the Kriegans to know about.
Lalric glanced at Blake. You've done your research.
Intelligence was my area. Not to mention I've had a few run-ins with your guild, said Blake. He waved a finger between himself and Seth. We'll take a look at what you got.
Then it seems I came to the right place, said Lalric. You were right that our freighter had sensitive cargo. Cargo that would require a level 7 replicator.
Seth nodded. He knew that was code for ship weapons. Replicators were classified by levels based on their functionality. The higher the number, the more complex the things it could create. The trade-off was that more elements and power were required. He knew that a level 4 replicator was bigger than the size of their ship. Most small weapons and ammunition could be done with level 2 and up, but level 7 usually meant the big weapons you would find on ships. Level 8 and higher were usually for construction. He glanced at Lalric. So, you know who took it, and you just need someone to take it back? How do you know it was Alcarez?
Lalric nodded. Alcarez offered to return it. For 200,000 credits.
Easier to hire someone to get it, and maybe waste him if he gets in the way, said Blake.
Lalric smiled. I doubt anyone would be distraught over his loss. However, you're uniquely qualified for this contract.
How's that? Asked Blake.
Alcarez is on Generis somewhere. Generis is a Fredorian colony.
Blake raised a finger. Earthborn Rimworld colony, actually. Although since the original founding, later generations called themselves Rimborn.
Lalric gestured at Blake. You just made my point. The ship is to be returned here to Kilikun, which is where Alcarez said he would send it once payment was confirmed, but that won't be happening, obviously. The contract pays 50,000 credits.
Blake sat up in his seat. Did you say 50,000 credits?
Lalric nodded. It's higher than the normal rate, but the guild believes it's worth it for the right contractor. I believe that contractor would be you.
Seth waved a hand. Yeah, I'm sitting here too.
Of course, said Lalric. I'm not familiar with your record.
Seth shrugged. I just fly Blake around.
You must be good to work with Blake, said Lalric.
Well, someone needs to babysit him. Blake laughed as he backhanded Seth's arm. We'll take it.
Excellent, said Lalric. He tapped at the table screen and, after a moment, said, I've registered the contract and sent a 10,000 credit advance to your account. You get the rest when the ship is back. It is a private contract, so it won't show up on a search.
Blake nodded. All right. Before you go, what's the Trade Guild's thoughts on me taking this contract?
What you did in the past is in the past. Any complications pale in comparison to a completed contract of this nature.
Business is business.
Lalric eyed Blake. Yes, and although I'm not authorized for this, I know a deal when I see it. If you're looking for more permanent work with the Trade Guild, we'd be more than happy to have you. He glanced at Seth. And you too, of course.
Of course, said Seth with a sigh. I think we'll stick to this for now, said Blake. I've had to follow enough rules. You never know, though. It can't hurt to have options.
Lalric nodded. A born optimist. My contact details are on the contract. If you need to reach me, feel free to do so.
He slid out of the booth and placed both hands in front of him while bowing his head. Blake and Seth dipped their heads. Seth scrutinized the details of the contract on the table screen when Lalric walked off. After a moment, he said, There isn't much detail on where this Alcarez guy is. I'm surprised he was able to jack it. The freighter is a pretty decent size. Not too much defense, though. I mean, it could probably defend itself if it had to. It's kinda odd they would send sensitive cargo without much security. Blake pursed his lips for a moment as he scanned the contract details. It's traveling through high-security space. There shouldn't be a need for much defense, especially if they're tangling with a powerful trade guild that can hire ruthless, yet handsome freelancers. Seth laughed. Yeah, right. He narrowed his eyes. Why wouldn't they just send an army of mercs? Credits. If the cost to retrieve it is more than what's being asked for it, they would just pay it. That sends the wrong signal, though. Seth shook his head. I'm glad you understand all this. I wouldn't even entertain the idea if I didn't know what was involved, said Blake. He glanced at Seth. Or involuntarily endanger your life. Seth half smiled. I know, man. I trust you. He exhaled from his mouth. I don't know about you, but I could use some sleep. Go ahead to the ship. I'm not tired. There's a weapons dealer out here I've worked with in the past that can probably shed some light, especially since we're dealing with stolen weapons, said Blake. Seth looked around. Blake laughed. Come on, I'll hit the ship with you before heading out. Chapter 4. Blake watched as the ship door sealed shut. The world he knew was very different from the one Seth knew. Seth was more familiar with places in general, but did not interact with aliens much other than those at delivery ports. Bringing Seth into Blake's world could be dangerous, even fatal. He ran his tongue over his fangs as he activated his chameleon shield. With a final look at the ship, he headed out. Walking the streets of Kilikon alone at night was usually suicidal, especially if you appeared weak. He preferred not to be seen at all. While he was sure he could deal with whatever came his way, he did not want to make too many waves. The stone-tiled street he walked on seemed out of place with the high-tech buildings around it. Streetlights were placed haphazardly, and usually only ambient light came from signs or buildings. Kilikon was an unusual city and a prime example of knowledge pollution. The native Draka had no concept of spaceflight before multiple alien criminal organizations attacked it. Now they were the power brokers for the regional black market contract industry. A sound off to his right caught his attention. He paused as he smelled the air. Sweat. Alien sweat. And lots of it. He crept to the side of a building and peeked down the alleyway. His vampire night vision allowed him to detect multiple brawny aliens beating something. Whatever they were beating was dead. Probably someone who failed to pay their debts. He narrowed his eyes and continued on. 45 minutes later, he arrived at the one-story building that the weapons dealer Corden worked out of. He noticed that the lights that should be on were out. Even more unusual was that the front door was sealed. Corden was not shy about having lethal defenses, and although it was the middle of the night, that tended to be when he conducted his best business. Something was off. Blake was a blur as he crossed the street. He focused on the sounds around him, and the heavy breathing of a Draka filled his ears. After creeping toward the building, he jumped up to the roof. As he sneaked across it as quietly as he could, the low buzz of voices filled the air. Judging by the smell and noise, he registered at least 4 individuals. When he reached the back end of the roof, he went prone and looked over the edge. The back door to the building was slightly ajar, and a reptilian humanoid stood outside it next to a crumpled robot security guard. He knew immediately that the reptilian was a Drodalian, one of Fredoria's main rivals in this region of space. Corden never dealt with Drodalians, and if they were there, then he was in trouble. The robot guards he employed were no match for the Drodalians. Blake reached back for his version 10 Fredorian heavy pistol, or FHP-10, and brought it forward. He liked the pistol, but the downside was that it only had a few shots in it before needing a recharge. That was the issue with most laser-based weaponry. The downtime between recharges made them a specialized weapon. The more important aspect was that it could be fired silently, unlike his other pistol, the version 40 Fredorian light pistol, or FLP-40, which was automatic, loud, and meant to shred targets up close. It had high recoil and required some training to use. He leaned over the edge and took aim. After a moment, the Drodalian lay on the ground with a perfect hole in his head. Blake waited for a moment to see if the Drodalian hitting the ground caused any movement from inside. After a minute, Blake jumped down and dragged the Drodalian off to the side. Blake opened the door a bit after holstering his FHP-10. Listening intently, he heard two voices. The grunting and squeaking noise was Corden. Whatever the Drodalians were doing was causing Corden pain. Blake slipped into the building, and after verifying the room was empty, stuck against the wall as he crept toward the voices. When he was outside the open door, he paused to pull out one of his blades and his FLP-40 while he listened.
"You're going to tell us where the information broker's network is before the night is out. You can keep playing ignorant, but we'll keep coming back," said one Drodalian.
"For the last time! I don't know anything about that,"
said Corden. A slapping sound echoed out. Blake had heard enough. He stood and peeked into the room. Corden was tied to a beam, and his jelly bean-like body showed signs of damage. His lips were bleeding, and the dejected look in his eyes made Blake's blood boil. Both Drodalians had their backs to him. He took out the first one with his FLP-40, shredding the Drodalian into strips of flesh. Lunging forward, Blake kicked the other one in the backs of the knees. The Drodalian tumbled and spun around after hitting the ground. Blake placed his blade against the Drodalian's throat. "Well, hello there. Did you have a party? And not invite me?"
What?
asked the Drodalian in a gravelly voice. "Don't worry about your friend outside. He has a massive headache or something. Your other friend is all shot up about something too. So, tell me, why are you torturing my friend?"
"I'm not telling you shit, Fredorian."
Blake holstered his FLP-40. "Earthborn, actually. I'm going to ask you again. Why are you torturing my friend?" The Drodalian spit on the ground. "Okay, have it your way," said Blake. He pressed a button on his blade, causing orange electricity to arc around it. With a swipe off to the right, the Drodalian's head spilled to the ground. Blake looked at Corden and wagged a finger. "You have some interesting friends."
"Damn it, Blake! Just untie me!"
Blake walked around the beam where Corden was tied and studied the wrist constraints. "Pull your wrists apart." Once Corden complied, Blake sliced through the constraints. Corden stumbled over to a stool and sat down, using the nearby table to steady himself. His breathing was jagged.
"Not sure why you're here, but thank you. I think they would have killed me this time."
Blake nodded. "Me too. What's all that talk about information broker network stuff?"
"Not important," said Corden. "They seem to think I'm an informant in the network."
Blake eyed Corden. "Are you?" Corden laughed.
"I'm just a simple Draka that sells weapons. Nothing to see here."
"Uh-huh," said Blake. He had heard rumors when he was a Fredorian Ranger that Corden was an information broker informant. Corden wiped blue blood from his lips.
"Serious. These Drodalians have been bothering me for a while now. My defense system killed one last month. I had a contractor that worked out well initially, but they got him last week. My latest was a robot guard, but no idea where it's at."
Blake looked around and grabbed a cloth. As he handed it to Corden, he said, "It's outside." Crumpled on the ground.
Figures.
Blake pulled his lips in for a moment. "Well, I just came to ask you about a contract, but I can come back later." Corden shook a hand out.
Let me see it. I need to call cleanup to get these guys out of here."
He pointed at the ground near Blake's boots.
"Watch where you step, Their crap is leaking.
Blake watched the ground as he joined Corden at the table. He placed a credit card-sized device on the surface and accessed the contract after it appeared. Corden spun around in his stool and interacted with the surface screen on the table. After a moment, he said,
Alcarez.
Blake narrowed his eyes. That's what the contract says. Last I heard, he was holed up somewhere in the Zalidax system, 4 systems away from Generis. I'm not sure what he would be doing out here, risking his ass in high-security space.
Your information is outdated. Your buds over in the FDF took control of the Zalidax system. Actually, they cleared out everyone.
Blake pursed his lips. I didn't hear anything like that.
You probably wouldn't have. From everything I'm hearing, it was a secret operation. Alcarez and others have moved to the Alcarez system and to the Fredorian rim world of Generis.
And you know all of this how?
I'm a weapons dealer. We have our own private network. Alcarez is trying to sell some ship weapons for 300,000 credits.
Blake nodded. So, where do you think he is on Generis?
Probably in the capital city of Tuca, is my guess. You can hide almost anything there.
Corden coughed up blood. After wiping his mouth, he said,
What I do know is that Tuca has a lot of factions. Fredorian, Earthborn, Rimborn, and factions within each of those. It's a dangerous place, for human and alien alike.
He eyed Blake.
Are you going out there alone?
I got Seth with me. Corden shook his head.
You're gonna need more than that. Alcarez doesn't trust anyone. He's all about robots and androids.
I'll find him. I've been to Tuca before, but it's been a while. I know the place to hit for information.
Corden snorted. What you need to do is get a bigger crew. You're tough, but take on Alcarez and his whole merc group tough? I don't know.
You're talking to Blake Brown, said Blake with his hands out to the side. Corden chuckled, then grabbed his side.
Damn it! Stop making me laugh. Tuca makes Killicotton look like a safe zone.
Well, don't worry about me. I can deal with whatever comes up.
Just be careful, said Corden.
He looked down at the Drodalians.
I need to clean all this crap up. But you're welcome to stick around.
Blake nodded. I'll stick around until the cleaners have come and gone. I don't think the Drodalians had a backup, and if they did, they'd be here by now. I'll waste them if they do come. Fair enough? He could see Corden was still shaken. Corden's eyes misted as he licked his lips and nodded. 6 hours later, Blake was on his way back to the ship. It had taken a while for Corden to calm down, and when the cleaners came, he was more than happy to help them remove the dead Drodalian bodies. Although Blake wanted to leave a bit earlier, he waited until Corden's new security robots came. Blake thought 8 was a bit much, but it was obvious Corden was not taking any chances. He had been talking about installing a panic room with an escape route out the back for a while. Blake suspected those plans just moved up in priority. The sun was just coming up, casting its rays of light across town. He recalled reading stories about vampires on Earth and their sensitivity to sunlight. It did affect one vampire strain, but it did not destroy them. His strain had no problems with sunlight or garlic, but a stake, bullet, or any other object through the heart would kill him, just like it would any human. He knew that where he was going, there was an ongoing battle between various factions, vampire, human, and alien. His thoughts refocused on getting to the ship. He figured Seth would probably be getting up by now. His immediate plans were to get to the ship, brief Seth, then nap on the way to Generis. It was about 2 light years away, so it would take 6 hours. As he passed by the alleyway where he had seen the aliens beating something the night before, he peeked in. A dead Draca lay on the ground, the upper half of its body indistinguishable from the garbage near it. He shook his head. Killikun was deadly at night, but thankfully, much less so during the daytime. When he got to the ship an hour later, he activated and lowered the rear door. Once on board, he saw Seth in the cockpit, watching an Earth TV show. He slid into the seat next to Seth. "Morning," said Seth. Blake nodded as he eyed the show. "I see you're going to have a lot of fun with that cube." "Hell yeah," said Seth. "These science fiction shows are hilarious. This one group is traveling all around the galaxy via stargates. Can you imagine that?" Blake eyed Seth. "You miss Earth, don't you?" Seth looked down for a moment, then glanced at Blake. "Well, yeah. Don't you?" Blake shrugged. "I was turned in the late 1500s. I've had my fill of Earth. The best thing to happen to me is the gift I received from my master, Lord Noskov." "Becoming a vampire?" Blake nodded. "My life is better now out here. Easier to find places to sleep, a big variety of blood types, and the quality of life enhancements are solid. So do I miss Earth? Some, mainly my clan, and my disciple, Mikhail. But it is what it is. I prefer being out here, to be honest. Besides, if we went back, the Helians and Kregan hunters would kill us." Seth shook his head. "Such a dumb rule. I get knowledge pollution. But in your case, non-humans on Earth already know about aliens and their technology. Like, what the hell would being on a slave ship do to pollute anything? I don't know. That's the rules. Lord Noskov has a friend that could have easily brought me back," said Blake, clenching his jaw for a moment. I guess maybe that friend wasn't as close as Lord Noskov thought. Seth shook his head. Well, what'd you find out? Anything?" Blake put up a finger, then slid out of his chair, getting breakfast real quick. After a moment, he returned with a glass of blood. As he sipped it, he covered the events with cordon and filled Seth in on the contract details. Seth sat back in his chair afterward and ran his hands through his short, curly hair. "Sounds like we should probably fill up our element storage tank while we're here. Anything else I should pick up?" Blake bobbed his head. "We could probably use a grappling hook gun. Oh, and some binoculars. I lost both on my last Ranger mission and forgot to pick up replacements. You might also want to check out their armor selections, too. Something tough. And you know where to get these? Next to Gambuno's. You can't miss it. They have a level 3 replicator there." "Uh-huh," said Seth. "And what do you plan to do with those?" "I suspect we're headed to a rough district." Seth sighed. "All right, I get it. The armor's for me. I'll get those, then we're off to Generis." Blake nodded as he watched Seth get up and head out. Once Seth was gone, Blake went to his private quarters and stripped down to take a nap. 7 hours later, he awoke to Seth pounding on his door. "We're here," said Seth. Blake yawned as he slipped on his body armor and headed to the cockpit. Once there, he scanned the navigation panel on the front console. The amount of small ships was the first thing he noticed. Given how important Tuca was, it made sense that its spaceport would be a high-traffic area. Tuca stood out as a red dot on the planet image. "We've been cleared for landing already," said Seth, tapping at the console. "Headed to Tuca." "You get any rest?" asked Blake. "I got a nap in." Blake nodded. The ship approached Generis. "How are we going to find out where Alcarez is?" asked Seth. Blake half smiled. "I know a club we can hit." "What if Alcarez isn't here?" "One problem at a time." "Is this how every contract is going to work?" asked Seth. "Fly by the seat of our pants?" "You would hate intelligence work." "Sounds like it." Seth interacted with the console as the ship entered the planet's atmosphere. 20 minutes later, they approached a large spaceport that bustled with activity on the outskirts of Tuca. Blake narrowed his eyes as he surveyed the outline of the city. It looked like it had changed significantly since his last visit several years ago. Tuca was circular in design, with transportation systems lining the outside. Large metallic skyscrapers stood out in the center of the city, forming an impressive skyline. The waning sun lit up everything, causing a sort of glow to permeate the air. Tuca was one of the newer rim colonies that had been rapidly built with replicators and a small army of robot workers and machines. Fusion reactors powered the city, and with massive element storage tanks, replication for sustenance was not an issue. It did not take long for Ceros Industries to get Tuca up and running, but that was what they were known for. Although Tuca overall was high-tech, he knew that where they were going, there would be a mix of low and high-tech in general. Seth pointed at one of the skyscrapers. "Fancy place?" "From out here, sure," said Blake. After they landed in the designated spot given to them by the spaceport controller, they did a final check that their weapons had full clips, and then disembarked. Once the ship was secured, they headed down a walkway with lights on each side, showing them where to go. Seth looked around as they walked. "Man, look at these ships!" "We'll have one better than them in a few contracts," said Blake. He could see why Seth would be amazed. Tuca's spaceport was a who's who of elite ships, mostly Corvette and frigate class or smaller. They reached the building that acted as a transition between Tuca and the spaceport after 20 minutes. A Fredorian security detail stood outside the entrance, flanked by several robot guards. Blake and Seth pulled out small, playing card-sized devices. After a moment, the security guards waved them through. Once inside, Seth glanced at Blake. "So, to the club then?" Blake raised a finger as they passed two humanoids in black and gold light armor with red armbands. They were talking to another male humanoid in a brown robe with a belt. The man's sweat scent filled Blake's nose. He knew the other humanoids to be Covendrin mercs, considered the elite among other mercs. One of them glanced at Blake and then nodded. Blake returned the motion. The merc turned his attention back to the Rimborn. After they had passed on, Seth gulped as he glanced at Blake. "That Covendrin nodded at you." Blake smiled. "Guess they know Blake Brown has arrived." "Let's hope that's not a negative thing," said Seth, looking around with narrowed eyes. Blake laughed. "Given how crazy the power struggles are here, no surprise to see them. I'm sure a lot of merc companies have moved in since I was last here." As they entered the outskirts of Tuca, Seth took a breath. "Smells nice out here." Blake swatted Seth's arm. "Hold on to that smell. It gets much worse." "Of course. I just hope you know where to go." Blake slapped Seth on the back. "Loosen up. Enjoy the sights and smells of Tuca, the home of our first freelance contract." He pointed ahead at one of several tunnels leading underground. The tunnel had the text District G hovering above it. "That's our destination." "Underground transportation. Always fun," said Seth. "Tuca is a city built on top of a transportation network. You can get anywhere within the city with it. We could take the transport on the outskirts, but it's not free. Where we're going is District G. It's one of the districts outside the main city's circular hub." "How many districts are there?" asked Seth. "About 18. Don't worry, we'll be in a transportation unit the whole way." "Yeah, sure thing," said Seth, licking his lips as they approached the entrance. Chapter 5. After an hour on the underground transportation system, they emerged into District G. Seth noticed the change immediately. The smell of garbage caught his nose. That it did not filter over to the spaceport surprised him. Maybe there was some type of barrier between districts. He noted that everything looked bleak, like the area was built just to provide cover instead of any unifying aesthetic. Gone were the high-tech buildings he saw when he first entered Tuca. In their place was a concrete and steel jungle that looked tossed together. With nightfall coming on, the various bright lights around the district had begun to turn on. As they headed out, a commotion off to the side caught their attention. A silver android had a young male humanoid in a black trench coat and black sunglasses backed up against a concrete wall in an alleyway between two buildings. The humanoid had a shaved, slightly domed head and pointed ears with paler than usual skin. Blake smiled. I see an opportunity. Oh, come on, seriously? Asked Seth. Trust me. You sure about this? Blake tossed both hands out as he drew his lips to the right. Yeah, you're sure. Let's go, said Seth. He pulled out his FLP-40 as Blake took out his striker. They approached the android. Hey, asshole, said Blake. The android shoved the humanoid to the ground. It then wheeled around and began to approach Blake and Seth. Their weapon fire dissipated the android's kinetic shielding, then shredded the android. They walked up to the trembling male who had his arms around his face. Viserion? Asked Blake. The male shook his head. All right then. What's your name? The male sighed. Javiet. He tilted his head. I sense we're similar. Blake bobbed his head for a moment. Similar, yes. I'm a different strain than you. Ancient vampire strain, to be exact. Anyways, why was that android shaking you down? Javiet lowered his arms and licked his lips. Alcarez's goons. He's making a play for this district. That android was going to torture and then kill me after it got the information it wanted. Great. A gang war, said Seth with a sigh. Blake exhaled from his nose. How much do you know about this district? In what sense? Asked Javiet. Politics? Who runs what? You know, the layout? Javiet nodded. Why do you want to know? Blake nodded back out of the alleyway. We're headed to Vises, assuming it's still under Viserion control. I haven't been out here in a while and could use an update. Vises is still under their control, said Javiet. I'd appreciate an escort. Blake waved forward. Let's go. As they walked out, Javiet sighed a breath of relief. Definitely wasn't expecting any help. Those androids are strong. By the way, I'm Seth, said Seth, pointing to himself. He crooked a thumb at Blake. And that's Blake. Blake Brown? Asked Javiet with wide eyes. Blake narrowed his eyes. Yeah. Is that going to be a problem? No, just, you're sort of like a legend in the Rim colonies. Seth laughed. Blake jerked his head back at Seth, and then faced Javiet. So you're not with the Viserions? I'm assuming that since you said they instead of our in reference to who controlled Vises. Which crew are you with? The Fallen. Must be new. I haven't heard of them before. Makeup? Asked Blake. Mostly Rim-born, and a few non-humans like me. The Viserions let us operate on their turf, said Javiet. Not a lot of us. Blake eyed Javiet. Who are the other big players? Javiet looked around as they rounded a corner. West side is the Red Wave, some Fredorian cult that got kicked out of Fredoria. East side is the Rookers, a non-human group that has some aliens in it. Central and south side is Viserion, which, as you probably already know, is a vampire-heavy faction. North side is the Crazy Eyes, another mixed group of merc. Sounds lovely, said Seth. There's a lot more, but they're small with minor turf and usually do the bidding of one of the big four. Blake gestured out. And now Alcarez has entered the picture. Yeah, he's been sending these androids around, sometimes with robot guards to shake people down, rob, eliminate known members, you name it. Blake rubbed his chin. He's trying to cause everyone to fight each other, and then he'll move in during the confusion. That might actually work for us. For what? Asked Javiet. Not important. Do you know where Alcarez is holed up? Javiet shook his head. Someone in Vises would know. A Viserion member would, anyways. That's what I figured, said Blake. As they neared the club, synthesized music with a hypnotic beat bellowed out. Several Rimborn dressed like Javiet came forth. Javiet put his hands out. They're cool. Wasted one of Alcarez's androids.
The Rimborn looked at each other and nodded. Blake glanced at Javiet as he and Seth walked up to the club door. Stay in trouble. He grinned, showing his bared fangs. Javiet and the others around him laughed and nodded at Blake. As they entered the foyer area, two muscled men in light armor put their arms out. Fellas, said Blake with his hands out, not here to cause trouble. Just want to relax. One of the muscled men looked Blake up and down while running a gadget over him. The other man tapped at a panel on the wall with the number 34. The panel slid out, revealing a drawer. All weapons. Blake sighed as he handed over his striker, 2 pistols and dual blades. It took him a moment to get his belt off and pull out the various small weapons hidden in his suit. Seth handed over his 2 pistols. Blake put his hand on his crotch. Not sure how I'm going to get this in there. Seth laughed. The muscled men grimaced as they waved them into the club. After a few minutes, they found an open table. Seth enjoyed the atmosphere of the club. It was almost all humans as far as he could tell, and the mesmerizing beat and synthesized sounds were soothing to him. He could imagine that he was on Earth for a moment. Smoke filled the air from the electronic vaping devices in use everywhere, and he was sure that it probably was not tobacco in them. There were a variety of people dressed in a similar fashion to Javiet. Black clothing, shaved hair, and a variety of gadgets on the heads seemed to be the rage. Blake pointed to a man behind a console of some sort on the stage. When he goes on break, he's who we need to talk to. Seth followed Blake's gaze. The DJ? Yeah, he's Viserion. How can you tell? Asked Seth. Vampires know their own kind, even if they're a different strain. Viserions are mostly of a strain known as Rascarian, at least from what I remember. I never got along with them on Earth, but out here, it's a whole different game. Oh. Seth's attention focused on Javiet and his friends stopping by the table. So, I was talking with everyone, and we decided to help you out, said Javiet. If we can do it, that is. Blake tilted his head. You can, actually. When the DJ goes on break, tell him we'd like to talk to him. Javiet nodded. You got it, man. He's the best damn rimwave DJ I've ever seen. Rimwave? Asked Seth. Blake laughed. It's what they call the music you're listening to. It's a mix of synthesizers, electric guitar, and thumping beats, similar to what you would know as cyberpunk or synthwave. What makes it unique is they also include alien instruments and sounds into it. It's a fusion of multiple cultures. Damn, you know your shit, said Javiet. He flapped his hands out to the side, hitting 2 of his friends. We got you, man. You just sit back and relax. Blake nodded. Seth watched Javiet take off. Kid probably doesn't realize how close he came to death. He does, said Blake with narrowed eyes. If you noticed, he's wearing a new set of pants. Seth peered at Javiet off in the distance. He laughed. Holy shit. Let's get something to drink while we wait, said Blake, tapping at the table screen. Seth reflected on the ease with which Blake interacted with others. It was a calm, level-headed approach that could turn violent in a snap. Blake's lack of fear made Seth a bit more relaxed. He had wanted to know more about the Rim colonies in general, and this was turning out to be a first-rate tour of one of the bigger cities. Looking around, he could now pick out the patterns of various groups. He focused on the table and getting a drink. 30 minutes and several shots later, the DJ walked over to their table. Seth noticed that, like Javiet, the DJ had pale skin, a slightly elongated, domed, shaved head, and pointed ears. Various gadgets ringed his head, and multiple piercings covered his face. With black pants, a black sleeveless shirt, and black boots, it was hard to see him. Tattoos covered his neck and arms. Blake smiled and bared his fangs. He pointed at himself, then Seth. I'm Blake Brown, and that's Seth Williams. Got a moment? The DJ eyed them both, then raised his head a bit. In a rough voice, he said, DJ Shrike.
What's up?
Sit, said Blake, pulling out a chair. DJ Shrike took a seat. He put his elbows on the table and glanced at Blake.
I've heard of you. The outlaw vampire.
Well, I have no clan, if that's what you mean. My master is far away, and a bit more powerful than what's out here. DJ Shrike drew his head back a bit.
So I've heard. Also heard you serve with the Fredorians.
20 years as a ranger. But I'm freelancing now, and looking for a sleazeball known as Alcarez. DJ Shrike sat up in his chair.
What about him?
Blake rubbed the side of his face. For starters, I know you're Rascarian, and most likely with the Viserion. I can sense you, and I'm betting the Viserions know where Alcarez is.
Maybe we do, and maybe we don't.
Tough customer, said Blake with a smile. I like that. He raised a finger. However, I have something to trade. Seth glanced at Blake.
And what would that be?
Asked DJ Shrike. Oh, you know. Just the last 5 years of all music from Earth, said Blake.
DJ Shrike jumped out of his chair. You serious? You messing with me?
Dead serious, said Blake. Get me a storage device, and we'll fill it up. All we ask for is Alcarez's location. DJ Shrike sat back down and ran a hand over his mouth.
Normally have to talk to the council about this, but people love my shit. They'd crap over what I could do with 5 years of fresh new music samples. You know that data is illegal, right?
Yep. DJ Shrike took a deep breath while nodding.
How do you want to do this?
We'll fill up your device and then meet you wherever you want. DJ Shrike looked around.
You docked at the spaceport?
Yeah.
All right. I'll meet you at the underground transit point, near the spaceport entrance. I'll leave shortly after you two do.
Blake glanced at Seth, who nodded. Fair enough. See you then. After an hour, Blake carried the storage device that Seth had filled. They were hassled by spaceport security on their way back in, but after the device was scanned, the guards let them through. The entrance to the underground tunnel network that led to District G came into view. Blake looked around as they walked down the slightly angled ramp. His senses picked up DJ Shrike immediately. The stench was harder to detect in the club, but near the spaceport it stood out. He waved a finger forward.
He's up ahead.
Seth narrowed his eyes as he peered in that direction.
Don't see him.
Blake wrinkled his nose. Oh, he's here. You and your vampire sense of smell, said Seth, shaking his head. It saved my ass more times than I can count. Hygiene usually isn't the top concern for most mercs, alien or otherwise, said Blake. They paused on the side platform. Blake scanned the crowd getting into transportation units. His eyes traveled across the center part of the tunnel where the units were loading and unloading. On the other side was DJ Shrike, leaning against the wall and vaping. They walked to a bridge that had steps on each side and allowed travel across the center of the tunnel. Once they crossed it, they approached DJ Shrike.
Didn't think you were coming, he said.
Security gave us a hard time, said Blake. However, as promised, the goods. He handed over the storage container. DJ Shrike tapped at the digital interface on the side of the storage container. After a moment, his eyes widened.
Man, you weren't kidding.
Now about your part of the deal, said Blake. DJ Shrike slipped the storage container under his arm and licked his lips.
Alcarez, that shitbag is in District H. He runs a small spaceport on the edges of the district, illegal ships and all that.
Blake interacted with his forearm device, causing a screen to flip up. After a moment, he turned the screen toward DJ Shrike. Mark it. DJ Shrike tapped at the screen for a few moments, then nodded.
Done.
Now, who are his rivals in the area? DJ Shrike furrowed his eyebrows.
Mainly the Red Wave, tough group, and they have marked their territory. There are some smaller groups, but they pose no threat to Alcarez's crew.
Blake nodded at the screen. DJ Shrike tilted his head. Draw a rough outline.
Oh, said DJ Shrike. He ran his finger across the screen for a bit. It would be a lot easier to give you one of our maps, but I suspect you don't want this to be traced. Blake grinned. I have to ask, why do you want to meet him? Blake laughed. Meet? More like take back what's been stolen. Good luck with that, said DJ Shrike. You know his crew is mostly robots and androids, right? Auto-aim? Asked Seth. DJ Shrike nodded. Yep, he doesn't trust anyone. Probably because he's a damn cyborg. All that metal crap messing with his head is my guess. Blake narrowed his eyes. I'm surprised that the Viserion are letting his android thugs walk your turf. DJ Shrike shrugged. Alcarez has some political clout with the city. We're still trying to figure out how he was able to move in so fast. He shook a finger. That spaceport used to be another group's base until Alcarez appeared and decided he wanted it. He tilted his head. If you do end up taking out Alcarez, the Viserions would be appreciative. Blake smiled. Of course they would. Enjoy your media. He tapped Seth's arm. Let's go. DJ Shrike pursed his lips and glanced at Seth. After whatever you're doing is done, feel free to stop by and hang. Could listen to some of this music. Got some things that can help you relax. Yeah, maybe, said Seth. I don't know what my status will be after this. Cool. Keep it in mind, said DJ Shrike. He nodded as he walked away. As Blake and Seth traveled over to get a transportation unit, Blake chuckled. Seth glanced at him. What? You don't know what just happened, do you? Should I? Asked Seth. Our boy DJ Shrike was inviting you to feed off of him. Seth's eyes widened. What? You would get into a mood all right. One that would probably end up with your pants off. Seth cleared his throat. He was coming on to me? He just wanted a bit of chocolate, I think. You're just messing with me, said Seth. After a moment, he tilted his head at Blake. Right? Nope. You probably didn't notice him checking out your crotch several times. Don't worry. He checked out mine too. Seth harumphed. Blake figured Seth would be surprised, since he did not know how depraved the Viserions could be. The last time Blake had been out there, he had several offers. Although he did not participate in any of them, he did watch some of what went on. Gender and species were of no concern as long as there were willing participants. It was no surprise that they were one of the bigger pleasure providers of the city, the Raskarian strain. In particular, those who were Viserion had an unusually high sexual appetite for anyone or anything, more so than Blake's strain. Anyways, it's almost 9:00 p.m. We should get some food and call it a night, then head out in the morning, said Blake. Sounds good to me, said Seth. After taking in a late dinner at one of the food stands near the spaceport, they spent the rest of the night in their ship. The next morning, they headed to the transportation system. Once they got into a unit, Blake selected District H. As the unit slid onto the middle platform and began to move, Seth turned toward Blake. Sounds like we got a fight on our hands, maybe. Maybe, said Blake. He glanced at Seth. Let's see what we're dealing with first. Well, at least we have a lay of the land. Definitely. Although, we may be able to play one faction off another, depending on their relative strength. We'll check out the Red Wave's turf while we're out there. Seth nodded. Wish we could just fly over and scan all of this, except we would be shot down. Tuca doesn't mess around with ships inside the city. I know. It must be pretty bad out here for them to outlaw it. Given the history of Fredorian rimworlds in general, not a bad policy, said Blake. He remembered reading about the early days of most rimworld colonies. Ships being able to fly in the city was one of the major damage dealers in that time period. Of course, being destroyed from space was always an issue. When the unit came to a halt an hour later, they went topside. Blake surveyed the environment. Like District G, District H was a concrete and metal jungle. Most of the buildings were only 3 or 4 stories high, but there were a few that went much higher. He pulled up his map. Alcarez's area, as outlined by DJ Shrike, was octagonal and sat on the upper left of the map. A red dot indicated where they were, on the bottom right. Blake pivoted his screen towards Seth and then pointed at an area to the southwest. If we head directly west, we'll be south of Alcarez's turf and run into red wave territory. He pointed at a building far off in the distance. If we head north and then east a bit, we should get a good vantage point from there to check out Alcarez's place. Seth nodded. Where to first? The vantage point. You can start scouting while I head to red wave turf. They have something I need. Seth narrowed his eyes. They do? I'll need one of their outfits, or at least whatever makes them look like Red Wave. Guessing something red. I'll need to look like a member when I start a turf war. What? Blake smiled. We're gonna need a distraction. Whatever it is, you can grab the ship and fly out. That assumes the codes we have are right and the ship hasn't been modified already. Plus, it might have its own security. Blake waved a hand out. They'll be too busy with the Red Wave to worry about that. Seth sighed. You could be caught in the crossfire, man. Sounds risky as hell. I'm Blake Brown, he said with a big smile and his hands out to the side. Yeah, I know, said Seth, chuckling. Blake slapped Seth's arm. Come on. After 45 minutes, they reached the tall building that Blake had pointed out earlier. It sat northeast of Alcarez's turf. Blake noticed that the building seemed empty as they took the elevator up. His vampire senses could smell that there were others around, but they seemed to stay to themselves. He could also hear the electrical buzz of robots, but he did not know where it was coming from. When they got to the roof, they knelt next to the roof's edge. Seth pulled out a pair of advanced binoculars. Spying time. He looked at Blake. Is this what you used to do? Usually. Always good to do reconnaissance. Cold up here, said Seth. He took a peek out over the edge and into the distance. After a moment, he said, I can see Alcarez's place from here. Looks like a shipyard and a large warehouse. DJ Shrike's outline wasn't too far off. Looks like the whole area is walled off in an octagonal shape. Blake stood. Good. See if you can find the ship and figure out any patrol patterns. Contact me if you run into any problems. Seth flexed his hand for a moment. Yeah, sure. Blake eyed Seth. This is the first time you've scoped a place, isn't it? Maybe? Blake smiled as he slapped Seth's back. Well, this is the easy part. Just note anything you can, and I'll be back shortly. Seth gulped. All right, man, good luck. He shook his head. I know. You're Blake Brown. Don't you forget it, said Blake, laughing as he headed to the roof exit. Chapter 6. Seth sighed as he settled in. This was a new experience for him, and a far cry from flying freighters. He had his doubts about being in the field, and often felt out of place next to Blake. Supporting Blake was an easy decision. On top of the possibility of getting a lot more credits, there was also the opportunity to explore instead of flying the same routes over and over. Seth checked the advanced binoculars he had set up on the knee-height edge. The last hour had been uneventful, but in that time, he had found the ship they were after. The patrols around the shipyard seemed random to him, and they seemed to consist of low-end robots that were barely humanoid. The robots had legs and arms attached to a solid cylindrical body. Their heads were more of a dome with red, indented grooves. He knew that was how they scanned, using light detection and ranging. They probably had radar too, from his experience. Scanning the warehouse showed a lot of activity. The open door was busy with cargo moving to and from the ships in the yard. Whatever Alcarez was up to, he was active at all hours. Seth recognized the various ships in the yard. Most were small transports, and a few medium-sized ships as well. He suspected that anything larger might draw the eye of city security. There were towers at various points around the perimeter, with a concrete wall between them. He counted only a few robots attending the towers. It was the drones flying around in the large, open area in front of the warehouse that caught his eye. He was not sure what type they were, but he suspected they were guard drones that could shoot. He shook his head. Distraction or not, there was a lot of security out and about. Still, it was a challenge, and one he had no doubt Blake would handle. He tapped at his forearm interface and pulled out a screen. After a moment, Blake's face appeared. "What you got?" asked Blake. Seth interacted with the interface. "Just sent you targets I've marked. Place is pretty secure." Blake nodded. "No surprise? Someone like Alcarez doesn't just appear without muscle." "Yeah. How's things with you?" "Just got to Red Wave Turf, roughly south of Alcarez's area. Going to head in and check it out. I don't suspect it'll take me long. Then I'll meet back up with you." Seth nodded. "All right. I'll continue looking around, but I think I've got most of what we'll need." Blake smiled. "All right." Seth closed the screen and sat back against the edge. He looked up at the clear sky and smiled. Even Tuca could resemble Earth if you looked up. Although it was his first time there, he had already learned more than he suspected he could on his own. That was one of the allures of traveling with Blake. His eyes squinted as a sound echoed from the doorway that led to the building underneath. He took cover behind a vent and pulled out his FLP-40. His heart pumped furiously when he realized the binoculars were still on the roof's edge. He peeked around the vent and saw a male android in a light power suit with several robot guards around him. With a gulp, Seth pulled back and looked up. He wanted to contact Blake, but didn't want to bring attention to himself. Maybe it was a routine patrol. "You can come out," said the android. "We have much more firepower than whatever you might have." Seth's skin went cold. The android was probably right, and they had the benefit of accurate aim. He opened his forearm screen and called up Blake. The busy signal made him close his eyes as he trembled. He pulled off his forearm device and set it down. It took him a moment, but he set it to record and relay to Blake. With a deep breath, he stood and stepped out with hands raised. "There you are," said the android as he approached Seth. "Kneel. Hands behind your head." Seth complied. One of the robot guards had walked over to the binoculars and grabbed them. In a deep, digital voice, it said,
"He was spying."
The android nodded as the robot guard gave him the binoculars. "Of course he was. Why else would he be up here? It probably never crossed his mind that we would monitor such an obvious position. So, what faction are you a part of?" "Just sightseeing," said Seth with a smile. The android slapped Seth. "Don't test me. Organic filth. I could just kill you right here. Another slab of meat rotting in the wind, or what passes for it in this city." Seth clenched his jaw and looked down. The android grabbed Seth's hair and knelt near his face. "If you don't want to answer, we have techniques that will help you in that regard." "Look, it was just a contract to find a ship." "Which one?" "The one taken from the Tansi Guild." The android stood back up and, after a moment, tilted his head. "Alcarez might want to talk to you." "Stand up, meatbag." Seth complied. The android motioned forward. One of the robot guards went behind Seth and put its arms under Seth's armpits. The guard then locked its hands behind Seth's head. The other robot guard grabbed Seth's legs and pulled them out horizontally. The android walked forward, placing a hand on Seth's left ankle and twisted it hard. Seth yelled out. "Set him down," said the android. Seth writhed about in pain. His breathing staggered. "What the fuck was that for?" "You won't be trying to run away," said the android. He motioned forward. The two robot guards stood Seth up and stabilized him. "Now, time for you to meet Alcarez." Seth's mind reeled as the pain from his dragging ankle surged through him. This was not as easy as Blake had painted it to be. Seth tried to focus as he was pulled forward. His only hope was that Blake would check the recording and come after him. Otherwise, he did not think he would live long under Alcarez's watch. After a painful hour-long trip to Alcarez's base, Seth felt like his ankle was going to fall off. The robot guards had lifted him under the armpits, one on each side. Several times during the trip, they had lowered him, which put weight on his ankle. His immediate yelps caused them to lift him back up. He was at least able to see the ship they were supposed to retrieve. It sat off to the right of the warehouse. When they arrived at the warehouse entrance, more guards approached them. He was transferred to them and carried inside. The large matter replicators stood out to him. Those were level 4. He knew that meant they could produce minor ship upgrades and almost any type of handheld weapon. The matter conversion units were tiny in comparison, but it was the storage tanks that seemed to fill up most of the warehouse. After 5 minutes, he was brought into a room and tossed onto the ground. He saw about 15 cages, 6 of them filled with naked aliens that looked like they worked for the Tansa Guild. The smell of shit and piss permeated the air. He winced as the pain from his ankle reminded him of its uselessness. His breath staggered as he tried to sit up. 2 robot guards hustled in and stripped him naked. After tossing his clothes onto a pile in the corner of the room, they stood next to the entrance. Seth scowled. "Assholes."
"They are not to blame,"
said a light, gray-skinned man as he entered the room. Seth studied him. It was Alcarez. The one-piece suit could not hide the metallic components across his body. His long, scraggly black hair and scruffy beard stood in stark contrast to the smooth metallic plates that dotted his head. Alcarez pulled up a chair from the wall and set it next to Seth. After sitting down, he said,
"So, you hoped to retrieve a ship. I must say, they really are scraping the bottom of the barrel these days if they sent you."
Seth grunted as he sat back up.
"How much did they pay you?"
Seth gritted his teeth. Alcarez slapped Seth, causing him to spill to the ground.
"I said, how much did they pay you?"
50,000, said Seth, looking down. Alcarez let out a deep laugh.
"Idiots. You know that you are the 3rd merc to come this way. And I use the word merc lightly in this case."
He eased back into his chair.
"I had to kill the other 2. They thought they were tough."
He peered at Seth.
"Do you think you're tough?"
Seth sighed. He did not want to give up any more information than he had to, but he figured maybe some misdirection would work. "You got me, all right. I was just supposed to confirm where it was. I mean, look at me. Do I look like someone that would storm your base?" Alcarez eyed Seth. After a moment, he said,
"No. You're weak. Interesting tactic. I bet they planned to send a large strike force once you reported back in."
He looked around the room for a moment.
"I can accept that you were recon. However, how did you know to take that specific vantage point?"
"It was the tallest building. I was just going district by district, picking the best place to look."
"Uh-huh," said Alcarez. "And how did you know I was on Janaris, or even in Toka?"
"The contractor said you were. Figured Toka, being the biggest city, was a good place to start." Alcarez rubbed his chin.
"A valid approach. On the other hand, they could have deduced that from the other merc ships landing here, but not reporting back."
Seth shrugged. "Maybe. I don't know." Alcarez smiled.
"Just thinking out loud. Nonetheless, it's your lucky day. get to go into a cage and join the crew for ransom."
"That's nice." Alcarez laughed.
"It's been a while since I laughed. I'll even let you keep all your fingers."
Seth's eyes widened as he looked at the other captives in the cages. He had not noticed the cloths wrapped on their hands before.
"Oh, shit." "Oh, shit, indeed,"
said Alcarez as he stood. He motioned at the robot guards. The guards grabbed Seth and dragged him over to a cage. One guard opened it, while the other tossed him in. Once the cage was locked, Alcarez walked over.
"For your sake, you better hope the guild comes to its senses."
"I'm with you there," said Seth, licking his lips. Alcarez laughed again.
"An optimist."
He turned and exited the room. The robot guards left as well, then sealed the door. Seth looked at the others. 2 looked like they were already dead. Another had trouble keeping his eyes open. Another 2 looked like they were sleeping. The one nearest him was awake, but looked like he was in pain. Seth motioned at him. "You speak Cregan?" The Tansy crew member nodded and, in a weak voice, said,
"I do."
"I'm Seth." The crew member tapped his chest.
"Cortic."
Seth sighed. "Have they been feeding you? Or giving you water?"
"Once a day. Our metabolism demands more."
Seth shook his head. "That's messed up."
"Did you come alone?"
Seth looked around. He was not sure if the place was bugged, but decided to play it cool. "Yeah, I was just supposed to find the ship, and then they were going to drop Covendrin mercs in here." Cortic coughed.
Oh, it would be nice to see them destroy this place."
"Hang in there, man," said Seth. Cortic nodded.
"Surprised to see a Fredorian."
"Earthborn, actually. But I guess to everyone else, Fredorian." Cortic sniffled and lay back against his cage.
"I don't have much hope that we will survive."
Seth narrowed his eyes. "Don't worry. If help comes, I'm sure it'll be soon. They probably had someone tail me just in case." He glanced around the room. If Alcarez was listening, then maybe this would help Blake's efforts with the Red Wave appear to be more credible. "Alcarez won't know what hit him." Cortic nodded as he took a deep breath. Relax, man. Conserve your strength," said Seth as a pain shot up his leg. "I'll do the same. Hang in there."
"Your optimism is appreciated,"
said Cortic. He closed his eyes and lay down. Seth tried to get into a comfortable position, but the cage was barely large enough for him to lie down in. His ankle was throbbing. After inspecting it, he did not think it was broken, most likely sprained, but it hurt like hell. He looked up at the dim lights in the room. The uneven breathing of the other Tansy crew members filled the air. This was not how he expected his first contract to go. He had no doubt Blake would come, but the thought that maybe it would not be enough crossed his mind. With a sigh, he closed his eyes and tried to block out the pain. Chapter 7. It took about 45 minutes for Blake to get from the northeast vantage point to the area south of Alcarez's turf. He had activated his camouflage and kept to the alleyways for most of the journey. For areas that had an open space, he stuck to the sides of buildings. The Red Wave turf was easy to spot, with their emblazoned logos on the buildings. He had to take a moment for Seth's update on what he had found. With that done, Blake crossed the street into Red Wave territory. It was larger than he expected, occupying most of the areas south and southwest of Alcarez's ground. 2 males in red undergarments with metallic light armor clashed against the gray building they stood in front of. Blake set his communication status to disabled and crept to an alleyway next to the building. Looking around, he noticed that there was a stairway above him that ran on the outside of the building. A set of stairs led to the ground, but it was latched and flush with the stairway around the second story. He focused and then jumped up to the stairwell. His camouflage would give him some cover, since he did not see any type of thermal detection devices on the Red Wave guards. He pulled out his striker and aimed down the alleyway. With a quick burst, the sound of bullets hitting concrete reverberated around the alleyway. He slid his striker onto his back and pulled out his FHP-10 laser pistol. The two Red Wave members rushed around the corner with weapons drawn. They bobbed their heads and looked all around as they crept into the alleyway. When they had passed where Blake was, he pulsed 2 shots to the backs of their heads. They had no chance. He jumped down and checked that they were no longer moving. One of the members was about Blake's size. He stripped off the member's light armor and took his red undergarments. Blake pulled open a slot in his back armor and put the clothes in. He could hear faint heartbeats in the distance. Maybe more were coming. He hustled out of the alleyway and crossed out of Red Wave turf. Taking a moment to breathe, he enabled his interface. His jaw clenched as he listened to Seth and the android. With narrowed eyes, he shut off his screen and cracked his neck. Somebody was going to get hurt. He moved at the sound of someone shouting in the distance. The Red Wave must have discovered the bodies. Normally, he would have taken the time to hide them, but he was not going farther west into their territory. It would also put them on edge, which is where he needed them to be. His eyes turned slightly blue as he headed off to the vantage point. When he got to there 45 minutes later, he crept up the stairway with his striker aimed forward. It did not take him long to get to the roof. The smell of blood led him to a spot on the ground. There was not much, but enough to indicate that it was Seth's. He checked the vents for the interface, and once found, he noted that it was powered down, probably due to no active presence detected. He picked it up and put it into his back armor. Peering out over the edge with his own binoculars, he did not see any sign of Seth. He sighed and put away his binoculars. After taking a moment to focus, he headed back to Red Wave turf. If Seth was being held, it was probably at the warehouse, so he needed to get his plan moving, and fast. When he got back to the Red Wave turf after another 45 minutes, he found a tall building south of Alcarez's turf that he could use as a vantage point. Although there seemed to be more farther west, he only needed the closest one that would allow him to set something up. The smell of others nearby, combined with the noise they made, confirmed that the Red Wave were now agitated, probably still looking around. He used his grappling gun to pull himself up. Once on the roof, he took a position near the edge and began to scout around. In the distance, he could see the towers and concrete wall that Seth had marked surrounding Alcarez's southern area. A bit farther west from his current position, in Red Wave's turf, was an active club. He figured there would be plenty there who would get riled up at the first hint of an incursion by Alcarez. With that in mind, he climbed back down and headed that way. The mesmerizing beat of the club filled the air as he got closer. It always intrigued him that, despite all the alien music that most Earthborn heard, they still stuck to variations of music that was around at the time of their abduction. The Red Wave apparently had a thing for synthesized metal. He crept into an alleyway across the street from the club. As expected, there were a lot of Red Wave members in their custom colors, hanging out. He headed north toward Alcarez's area. It took him a bit to find a good 3-story building, but when he did, he grappled up. After a quick change to put on the red undergarments, he knelt at the edge and scoped out the nearest towers. 2 of them stood out to him. However, it was the small drones flying between them he knew he would need to hit first. After that, it would be the robots who came out to investigate. He figured a sticky grenade on the wall would open it up, and then he could create the commotion he needed. The tricky part would be to breach Alcarez's wall without being detected. His camouflage might work at a distance for most organics, but not against machines or those with heightened senses. He knelt and pulled out his striker. Using his underbarrel grenade launcher, he set the delay to 20 seconds, then shot a sticky grenade at the wall midway between the towers. Once he confirmed that it had stuck, he took aim and searched for the drone. It took a moment to find the drone again, and when it was near the sticky grenade, he fired. The drone crashed to the ground. A wailing noise shot out of the towers. Robot guards rushed to the drone. He calculated he had about 5 seconds. He rushed to the edge and used his grappling gun to rappel down. Halfway there, the grenade went off. Once on the ground, he hustled around the corner and took aim at the robots who were beginning to approach the breach. Drones had already begun to fly forward. He hit 2 drones and one of the robot guards, then turned and headed south to the club. When he got near, he ducked into an alleyway. He cupped his hands and said, "Alcarez is coming!" The reaction was immediate. Red Wave members drew their weapons and looked around. After a minute or so, the drones came into view. Once the first shots were fired, he knew it would escalate quickly. As the Red Wave and Alcarez's robot guards began to engage, he slipped through the crowd, heading east while taking a few shots at the drones. Once he was far enough away from the fight, he removed the red undergarments and then headed back toward the vantage point he and Seth used initially. As he walked, he observed the various towers. Although there was chaos near the breach he had created, the robot guards in the towers did not leave their posts. He did note that they were facing that direction, though. When he was a good distance away and southeast of Alcarez's turf, about halfway to the vantage point, he grappled up a building to get a better view. Looking back west, he could see that Alcarez's southern border with the Red Wave was a hive of activity as robot guards of all types rushed to the breach. He focused on the few towers that were on the southeast side of Alcarez's area. Most had just one guard in it. He selected one and grappled down to head toward it. After a few minutes, he reached the wall outside the tower. He pulled out one of his dual blades for his left hand. His right hand held the grappling gun, and after a quick shot at the tower, he was pulled up and over the wall. The robot guard had turned to investigate. As it looked over the edge, Blake leaped into the tower and sliced off its head. The guard's body crumpled to the ground. Blake landed inside the small enclosed area and knelt inside the nearest wall. The noise around him indicated that everything was being tossed at the Red Wave. He peeped out with his binoculars northwest toward the warehouse. If Seth had been taken anywhere, it was probably there. Blake decided to check there first. A path wound from obstacle to obstacle, but it required him to move fast. If he took out the 2 nearest towers, it would be much easier. His eyes darted back and forth for a moment. With a big grin, he holstered the grappling gun and put his blade back and then pulled out his striker. It was time to play. The journey to the warehouse was a good test of Blake's skill. He had paused several times on the way there to assess the situation. It had taken 30 minutes without detection, but he was outside the warehouse. Looking south, he could see the commotion had grown considerably. The Red Wave had deployed their large 2-legged mini-mechs, which were tearing through Alcarez's group. Alcarez had something comparable in his own souped-up, heavy robots, but they were few compared to the numbers the Red Wave was putting out. The discrepancy between an established power versus a new one was obvious. If Alcarez had more time, he might have been able to compete. For now, it was a slaughter. As Blake approached the warehouse, he took cover between 2 shipping containers. He sniffed the air and caught a hint of Seth's scent. The robot guards and various other machines were streaming out of the warehouse and headed toward the breach. Blake figured that Alcarez was activating his reserve defenders, but it would not be enough. Blake tapped at his helm and scanned the entrance. Switching between views showed him that there was electrical activity near the front 2 corners, just inside the entrance. Probably security cameras. He crossed over to the right side of the warehouse and parked himself between a ship and the warehouse wall. After getting his FHP-10 ready, he sneaked up to the right side of the warehouse entrance and took aim at the first camera when it came within view. Zit! The camera blew up. Blake snorted. Apparently, Alcarez had not invested in high-end security cameras. On top of that, they were facing inward instead of toward the entrance. Probably relied too much on his guards and drones to handle anything outside that. Blake took a moment to observe the pattern of robot guards going to fight the Red Wave. When he detected a pause between deployments, He crossed the entrance to the left side. Zit! The other camera blew up. Blake checked his FHP-10. It was close to recharge mode, meaning he only had a few shots left. He sighed as he slipped into the warehouse and hugged the left wall. After sneaking to the corner, he hopped up on one of the shipping containers and surveyed the warehouse interior. The warehouse was structured like a grid. The element storage tanks took up a significant amount of space on the right side of the warehouse, while the left was pure shipping containers. Near the back was a set of ramps that led to a second level and a set of offices. Along the sides of the warehouse was a series of small rooms. Blake figured that Seth was in one of the side rooms. There were 2 security cameras on each side of the warehouse near the middle that he would need to take out, but they were a good distance away and would probably detect him if he got into their line of sight. It was times like this that he wished he had a sniper rifle, or even someone who was capable of using one. While he could see long range, aiming and firing was a different story. He jumped down from the container and weaved his way to within range of the other cameras. It took a moment to line up a shot at the first camera on the left. Zit! It blew up, causing the few guards that had been rushing out to stop and investigate. Blake knew it would not be long before they figured the interior had been compromised. He took aim at the second camera on the right. Zit! The lighting dimmed as more guards went to the right side. The other guards had begun to fan out. Blake slipped off behind a shipping container and pulled out his striker. This was going to be a firefight. If it was organics, he would have probably gone with his dual blades and stealth. However, robots could see his thermal signature and most likely hear him. He knew there was technology that could cover the thermal signature, but it was not technology he had access to, and it was bulky relative to what he had. The shipping containers would be his cover. He moved forward up a path between the shipping containers and the side rooms. A robot guard spotted him, but crumpled when a stream of bullets overpowered its kinetic shields. Several more guards appeared. Blake took advantage of their processing. They would update each other on where the shots came from and target that area. With that in mind, he swung to the right and slipped behind another container. When the robot guards had advanced to where he had been before, he sprayed them down. According to his calculations, that was 4 robot guards. Given the intense pace of the other guards leaving the warehouse, he figured the red wave was getting close. He took a moment to focus. He could now see the wispy trail of Seth's scent. Several footsteps snapped him back to reality. He sensed that 2 more guards had come over. With a burst around the corner, he took them by surprise. He rushed past their smashed bodies and ran along the wall, taking care to follow Seth's scent. The shit and piss odor was strong, and getting stronger the closer he got to the back end of the warehouse. As he ran into a small, open area, he slid to a stop and began to backpedal. His heart went into overdrive. A massive, 2-legged robot with large weapons as arms and a rectangular pod on top of the legs pivoted and trained its guns on where Blake had stopped. He spun around and dove back behind the shipping container. The robot advanced. He had fought these before on a previous contract, low-grade defense robots, but effective for what they did. A spray of bullets hosed down the area next to him. He put his striker back and pulled out his dual blades. Although he was sure he could eventually burst down the robot's shields, he needed something that would go through it. It took a few seconds for him to figure out where the robot was by the heavy stomping. When it was nearing his spot, he jumped up on the shipping container and then launched himself onto the robot's backside. With a flurry of blows, he sliced up the power systems and cut off several of the weapon extensions as the robot's top spun around. A final power jab of both blades into the central part of the topside caused the robot to stumble and then tip over. Blake jumped off and, after a quick look around, continued on to the room he sensed Seth was in. As he neared the door, a voice came out over the communication speakers. "Whoever you are killing my guards and robots, I have an offer. Whatever you're being paid, I'll double it if you help me with the red wave." Blake knew not to respond, lest he give away his position. With the cameras down, he knew Alcarez could not see him.
I understand if you don't want to respond. If you leave now and help take down the Red Wave, I will consider that an agreement to contract. Otherwise, I will focus on hunting you. I'll give you a moment to consider your choice."
Blake shook his head as he slid to the side and pushed open the door where the odor was the strongest. After taking a moment to assess the situation, he burst into the room with both blades drawn. There were cages with people in it, and he homed in on Seth immediately. Seth coughed. "Huh, what took you so long?" "Well, I'm glad to see you too," said Blake. He sliced open Seth's cage. "We don't have much time." Seth pointed at the others. "The original crew, 2 dead. But we need to get the other 4 out. The one next to me is Kortik, and he speaks Cregan." Blake nodded and opened their cages. He returned to help Seth out of his cage. "What happened to your ankle?" "Damn android asshole twisted it to immobilize me." "I think they have their hands full at the moment. The Red Wave is attacking in force. They'll be here soon. And we don't want to be here when they do come." Seth nodded. "I'm going to be a liability. I can't walk." Blake grabbed Seth's clothes from the corner and then helped him get them on. Once Seth was dressed, Blake picked Seth up and slung him over his shoulder. Blake chuckled. "Just don't ogle my ass too much." Seth snorted as he winced in pain. Blake looked at the other crew members. "You guys good to go?" Kortik nodded. "Lead the way. And it's good to meet you." Blake tapped his chest. "Stick close to me." "No problem with that," said Kortik. They headed back the way Blake had come. "Time's up," said Alcarez over the communication speakers. "What's it going to be?" When they approached the entrance, weapons fire hit the area in front of them. "So, the Merc reveals himself. Where do you think you're going?" said Alcarez, rushing from the back with several guards. "No time for this shit," said Blake. He set Seth down and pulled out his striker. With a well-aimed shot, a grenade fired out in an arc and landed in the middle of the warehouse. After a moment, the grenade exploded, and the group rushed to the ship as the warehouse began to crumble in on itself. Once everyone was on board and settled in, Seth, Kortik, and Blake headed to the command center. After an awkward moment, Blake closed his eyes. "Let me guess. One of the dead was the pilot?" Kortik looked down. "I'm just a security guard." Seth sighed as he tried to work on the interface. "Damn it! It's not in Cregan." He glanced at Kortik. "I can probably figure out some of this. Most interfaces follow a general standard, but any help in translating would be awesome." "There's a language filter," said Kortik. "I know that at least. Give me a second." He tapped at the interface. Seth smiled when he could read the navigation interface. "There we go. Firing her up." The ship hovered for a moment, then tilted toward the warehouse. Alcarez had exited the warehouse with a limp, and a part of his face looked like it had melted off. "Damn, he's a tough son of a bitch," said Seth. When Alcarez made it to a small ship, Seth turned their ship toward it and fired a set of small laser beams. Alcarez's ship blew up, tossing Alcarez off to the side. He stopped moving. "Looks like that's taken care of," said Seth. Blake narrowed his eyes. "I'd go check if he was still alive, but we need to go. Fly by our ship and I'll jump out. Then we can meet in Killican. Be quick about it, though, since Toka will probably not be too fond of flying ships in the city." Seth's eyes misted. "Yeah, no problem. And thanks for coming." Blake slapped Seth on the back. "You got it, my abductee brother." Chapter 8. After dropping off the ship with Kortik and being paid by Lolaric, Seth went to Gambuno's to the exact table where they had met Lolaric before. He took a shot of whiskey as he watched the dancers on the far side of the room. It was 11:00 p.m., and he was exhausted, but completing the first contract required a celebration. His ankle had been attended to on the flight to Killican, and the thought that it would probably be the first of many injuries did not escape him. If Alcarez or his henchmen had gone a different route, that could have been it. Blake was to meet him here, and Seth was enjoying Gambuno's. It was more than just a contract hookup location. It had a lot of luxuries available. He had already been propositioned by a Ranaxian, a member of a matriarchal society. That was an offer he might have taken if he had not been waiting for Blake. The music was soothing, and the lighting dim. If Seth had wanted to take a nap, the atmosphere would encourage it. He adjusted himself in his seat, and a pain shot up his leg. It would be a few weeks before his ankle was fully healed, and he had a routine to follow with rest, raised legs, and reduced pressure. Flying the ship would be possible, but engaging in field work would have to wait. His attention focused on Blake entering Gambuno's. Blake hustled over to the table and took a seat. "How you feeling?" "I'm all right, I guess. A few weeks of rest and relaxation are in my future. On the plus side, we're 200,000 credits richer." 200? I thought it was 50,000. "Apparently rescuing the crew was a bonus," said Seth. "Cordic verified that Alcarez was killed, so we got another bonus on that, although I don't know if Alcarez really died." Blake furrowed his eyebrows. "It's possible Alcarez survived. I'll keep my ear close to Tuca and see what I hear. Yeah, if Alcarez survived, he's gonna come for us." "Let him come. He could die a real death then." Seth laughed. "You have no fear, do you?" Blake shrugged. "I've heard that even in death, the pure Daedrald can persist in some capacity in another reality. I don't personally want to find out, but if it happens, so be it." "Comforting," said Seth as he winced. Blake eyed Seth. "You know, if you drank some of my blood, your ankle would heal much faster." Seth shook his head while flashing a hand out. "I'm not drinking your blood, man. And my pants stay on?" Blake laughed. "Thought I'd offer. Besides, I'd let you keep your pants on." "Oh, well, thanks," said Seth with a smirk. He studied the table for a moment, then glanced at Blake. "So, what's the next step then?" Blake ran a hand over his mouth. He exhaled and said, "If you can still fly, we can maybe do some contracts where only I have to go out." Seth nodded. "I think I'd prefer that over what we just went through. I can walk with the exosuit I have on, but I can't be running around and all that for a bit." "You could have actually stayed on the ship for the last one, too," said Blake. He clenched his jaw for a moment. "What happened to you wasn't supposed to happen. Anyways, we'll need to get some armor and weapon upgrades." "And ship upgrades if we can afford it," said Seth. "That too," said Blake. A waiter brought a shot of whiskey to the table and placed it in front of Blake. "Just bring a bottle," said Blake. The waiter nodded and took off. Seth laughed. "You'll be drinking alone tonight." "Why's that?" Seth pointed at the Ranaxian female and gestured for her to come over. "You have your whiskey? I'm getting my reward. I was just waiting for you to come, but I think it's time to relax." He slid out of the booth and gingerly stepped up, using the table as support. His exosuit lit up as he stood. Blake smiled. "I'll see you in the morning. I'm going to browse potential contracts and see if anyone approaches." Seth nodded as the Ranaxian placed an arm around his waist. "And you'll drink the night away?" The waiter returned with a bottle. "Oh, don't you worry about that," said Blake with a smile, baring his fangs. Corden tapped the counter as he watched the security feed on the console underneath. A Cregan had entered the store, and the robot guards had already scanned him. Corden relaxed as he searched under the counter and pulled out a small playing card-like device. The Cregan walked up to the counter. "Ricard, we meet again," said Corden. Ricard nodded. "I heard you have something for me." Corden grinned and handed Ricard the device. "It's all there. Blake's recent contract details, statements, transaction information, ship specs, personnel involved, you name it." "You're very thorough." "Of course I am," said Corden. He tilted his head. "Why, Are you collecting this?
Ricard eyed Corden. That's unusual for an informant to ask.
It involves Blake, said Corden.
He swept his hand around.
Well, I wouldn't be here if he hadn't stopped in a few nights ago. A couple of Dredalian goons were going to kill me. Blake wasted them.
Ricard looked around. That sounds like Blake. I see you've enhanced your security setup.
Yeah, well, thanks to him, I have an opportunity to do that. He's also a good friend. I just don't want him to be blindsided by something is all.
Me either, but this is not a bad thing.
Corden licked his lips. All right. Blake already left the planet to do another contract, so I'm sure he'll stop in again.
And you'll see me again then as well.
I figured, said Corden. He eyed Ricard. You must have some pull with the broker to arrange this. I can't find shit on this arrangement other than what I need to do.
Ricard smiled. Oh, it's a long story.
One you can't tell. I know, said Corden with his hands out. Just makes me think there's an informant involved in the Fredorian government, one I don't know about. Maybe that's you.
Ricard narrowed his eyes. I cannot confirm or deny that.
Corden laughed. You don't need to. I know the rules. Plausible deniability.
Ricard slipped the device into his pocket. I appreciate your help in this matter.
Of course, said Corden.
He watched as Ricard turned and headed out. Whatever the Fredorian government was doing, they wanted to keep tabs on Blake. Corden did not think it was anything sinister, but it made him think that maybe there was something brewing there that they might need Blake's help with. Time would tell. The end. This has been Freelancing, the Earthborn Prequel. Written by Adair Hart. Narrated by Michael Wolfe. Copyright 2018 by Adair Hart. Production copyright by Adair Hart.